We talk all the time about this burden of, external information, the crushing wave of data, news feeds, analysis.
Right. Information overload.
Exactly. But sometimes the hardest and I think the most important information for an organization to gather is purely internal. It's that uncomfortable truth about the people running the show. Specifically, how well are they actually doing? Are they adhering to the core ethical standards?
And do they even know what the rules of the road are? That's a big one.
Right.
That's the classic management paradox, isn't it? When leadership tries to conduct an honest assessment of its own health, especially around things like compliance, ethics, operational controls, the people they need the most honest feedback from are usually the ones most exposed.
And so they're the most hesitant to provide it.
They're often the most hesitant, yeah, for good reason.
And that, for you, is the central challenge we're tackling in this deep dive. Our mission today is to go really granular, looking into the actual, the nuts and bolts practice aids, the proprietary tools that organizations use to review and report on their internal controls.
And we're focusing squarely on that entity-wide control environment.
Which is really the bedrock of everything.
It's the foundation. It's defined by the corporate culture, the ethical values, that's principle 1 in the COSO framework for anyone who follows it, and of course, employee competence, which is principle 4.
So we're looking behind the curtain at management's confidential toolkit. The surveys, the highly structured interviews that are designed to strip away the veneer and give them an unfiltered, honest look at the organization's ethical and operational heart health.
Absolutely. The source material for this is just fascinating. It's a collection of sample practice aids. They're really the blueprints for designing these critical employee surveys, for evaluating the very complex results, and for structuring those essential walkthrough interviews to verify that the internal controls are actually effective.
So we're essentially examining the rule book, the exact script an organization uses when it tries to give itself a rigorous, confidential, and mandatory checkup.
And more importantly, how you build the trust that's necessary to get honest answers in the first place.
That's where we have to start, the groundwork.
When management kicks off an internal review, especially one that dares to probe sensitive areas like ethical conduct or management transparency, the preparation phase is, well, it's quite simply everything.
You can't just drop it on people.
No, you cannot just drop a massive survey into an employee's inbox with zero context and expect anything remotely resembling meaningful or, accurate results.
No, you have to set the stage. You need to signal both urgency and, maybe more importantly, safety.
That's it.
And our sources outline a mandatory first step here, the preparation letter. This thing needs to go out to the entire organization, or at least the sample being surveyed, ideally 1 or 2 weeks before the actual survey.
That lead time is critical. It allows employees to mentally prepare and understand the scope of what's being asked of them.
It does 2 key things.
It does. First, it mitigates that element of surprise, which can, breed suspicion. And second, it establishes the seriousness of the initiative. And the single most vital component of that letter, according to all the practice aids, is the signature.
It has to come from the top.
It must be signed by the highest level of senior management, the president, or more commonly, the CEO. It's the only way to clearly convey that proper sense of urgency and importance.
Okay, but I want to challenge that for a second. Doesn't the CEO's signature risk introducing a kind of management bias?
Yeah.
I mean, if the boss is the one kicking off the process, aren't employees incentivized to only report problems that exist, say, below that CEO level?
Or worse, to sugarcoat the culture.
Yeah, exactly.
That is a very, very astute challenge. And it's why the content of the letter is just as important as who signs it.
Okay.
The source materials, they recognize this risk, but the perceived urgency, that signal that this is an organization-wide governance-level priority, that usually outweighs the risk of bias.
What's a trade-off?
It is. And if the survey is run properly, which means above all confidentially, then the power imbalance that's introduced by the CEO's signature is, well, it's minimized. The message is, this is serious, and the results will be seen at the top, which ensures there's a commitment to actually act on them.
And that letter also has to be really clear about the scope of the review.
Yes. It needs to be absolutely clear to the recipient that this isn't just about reviewing the tasks they perform in their daily work. It's about evaluating the foundational environment.
The culture.
The corporate culture, the systemic processes in which they perform those assignments. That clarity helps employees understand that their input is valuable on a systemic level, not just an individual one.
So they're assessing the health of the whole organism, not just their own liver function, so to speak.
That's a perfect analogy. But, as we mentioned, the single biggest hurdle and the most crucial contract management has to make with its employees is that promise of confidentiality.
That confidentiality contract is the engine that drives this entire exercise. The practice A's are just crystal clear on this. The most effective, honest, high-quality responses are only provided when individual results are kept strictly confidential.
And management only sees the summarized, aggregated form.
Right. If employees feel for a second they can be personally identified, the response quality just plummets.
And the exercise becomes an expensive form of self-delusion, a complete waste of time and money.
To really solidify this promise, many organizations use a common but very effective strategy. They route the whole process through a neutral third party.
A vendor, yeah. This vendor's only job is to host the survey, compile the raw data, and then summarize the results.
And if this external mechanism is being used, the advance letter has to mention it explicitly.
It has to. That external layer adds immediate, tangible credibility to the promise of confidentiality. It's not just us saying it's confidential. This outside company is guaranteeing it.
And that vendor handles the technical side of the trust contract, too. They're the ones logging completed responses, sending out the reminders for surveys that haven't been received yet.
And using an identification number that is purely administrative, it links the response rate to, say, an organizational unit, but never to an individual employee's name.
That's a key detail.
It is. Now, transparency is also key, especially if management isn't surveying absolutely everyone.
Right, if they're using a sample.
If they're using a statistical sample of employees, the letter has to explain that selection process very clearly and transparently. For instance, stating something like, we are sending this confidential survey to a random sample of 10% of all our employees in management across all departments.
And they can explain how you were chosen.
Precisely. Your name has been selected randomly by the independent vendor conducting the survey. This kind of openness, it combats any suspicion that the sample was cherry-picked or targeted.
So once that groundwork of trust is established, we can get into the pure logistics of the survey design itself.
And that's where you have to balance comprehensiveness with, well, attention span.
No.
Absolutely. Management needs comprehensive feedback on dozens of control environment elements, but nobody, especially busy people, is going to dedicate 2 hours to filling out a 100-page opus.
No way.
So there's this clear imperative to keep the survey as short as you possibly can to avoid diminishing response rates. Finding that balance between comprehensive feedback and necessary brevity is a huge design challenge.
And for large, really diversified organizations, the sources highlight a pretty clever strategy to get both depth and brevity.
Which is using several different versions of the questionnaire.
Yeah.
For a huge multinational, distributing one single massive survey is just impractical. So instead, they might create a survey A, a survey B, and a survey C.
And each one only has some of the questions.
Each version asks only a subset of the total questions, but, and this is the key part, they include overlapping sections or a core set of mandatory questions. This ensures that while no single employee answers every question across the entire surveyed population, management gets data on all 80 points they care about.
And that overlap is crucial. It lets them assess continuity and validity.
That's it.
By having, say, 10 core questions that appear on all 3 versions, they can make sure the overall cultural snapshot they get from Survey A is statistically consistent with the snapshot from Survey C. It just bolsters the robustness of the entire data set.
In terms of sheer methodology, the sources confirm what we'd expect. Web-based surveys are now the common approach.
Sure, they're efficient. You get instant data collection. Vendors are great at handling the design and summarization.
It's highly preferred over physical mail surveys for large entities, which are just logistically cumbersome, expensive, and so slow.
But for smaller companies, maybe mail is still an option.
For smaller entities, say fewer than 50 employees, physical mail surveys can still be practical. And sometimes they're even preferred if the workforce is maybe less digitally connected.
It all comes back to trust. The logistics of trust are really the foundation. You have to convince the employee that this is important, that their opinion matters, and that they will be protected.
If you fail there, you've failed everywhere.
Okay, so with the stage set, now we can pivot to the fun part. The actual questions designed to dig deep into the company's organizational DNA.
And the structure of these sample surveys is intentionally diverse. It's not just one type of question.
Right, we see a mix. We have these straightforward, factual questions, usually yes, no. Did you read the code of conduct? Simple stuff.
But then they're combined with far more nuanced opinion questions that use a rating scale.
Usually that 1 to 5 scale. 5 is strongly agree, want to strongly disagree.
Exactly. The purpose of this mixture is synthesis. The structure is built to get input that helps management assess those two critical topics: the company culture and ethical values, which is Principle 1.
And the human resource policies and competence Principle 4.
Right. They need both the objective data, did you see the policy, and the subjective perception, do you think the policy is actually followed?
And what's critically important here, especially for the analysis phase later, is the instruction they give about comments. Employees are often encouraged to add brief comments or examples to support their ratings, particularly if they select a 1 or a 5. But they have to be explicitly told not to include any personal identifying information.
No names, no dates, no specific project titles.
Exactly. This is essential to maintaining that confidentiality contract, especially with those free text responses where it's easy to slip up.
I think the psychological sophistication of these practice aids really shines in the note on question framing.
Oh, this is fascinating. The idea that some questions are deliberately worded in the negative frame.
Yes.
Why do that? Why not just ask everything in a positive way?
It's a cognitive strategy. It's aimed at combating survey fatigue and a phenomenon called satisficing.
Satisfying.
Yeah, when people are tired or rushed, they tend to just default to the middle rating, the 3, or they agree with every positive statement. They just go down the line, 5, 5, 5, 5.
Straight lining, they call it.
Exactly. By throwing in a negative framed question, something like, the company's performance review system is confusing and subjective, you force the respondent to slow down. They have to process the negation and consciously decide if they agree or disagree.
So it encourages thoughtful engagement instead of just rote agreement.
It significantly improves the quality of the data. You avoid what they call garbage data.
That's a great insight. Okay, let's do a deep dive into ethical values Principle 1. The goal here is a comprehensive assessment that moves beyond just awareness. It's about measurable action and trust.
Right. They start with foundational awareness, which often uses that simple yes-no format. I have read and understood the company's code of conduct, or I know where to access the company's whistleblower policy.
That's the bare minimum.
That's table stakes. But immediately, they pivot to the code's functional utility. A question like, the company's code of conduct provides practical, real-world guidance that helps me identify unacceptable business practices.
So it's not just a legal document, it's a tool.
It has to be a tool. Management is responsible for developing the policy, sure, but employees need to be able to actually refer to it if they encounter an ambiguous situation.
And then comes the crucial shift to trust in the system. Because if awareness is high, but trust is low, the ethical environment is still fundamentally broken.
Precisely. They gauge belief in timely, appropriate investigation and resolution. The question might be phrased: if I observe unacceptable behavior on the job and report it through the proper channels, I believe that the matter will be investigated and resolved appropriately on a timely basis.
In that phrase, on a timely basis, that's key.
It's so key. Delays kill trust faster than outright inaction.
And that trust assessment has to go beyond just reporting. It has to address how management values ethical people and how it deals with unethical people.
We're talking about incentives and punishment.
Right.
Absolutely. The organization needs to show that ethics isn't just a poster on the wall. So employees are asked to assess whether ethical people are valued and rewarded. For example, I believe that people who demonstrate a commitment to high ethical standards of behavior are recognized and will be rewarded.
Specifically through compensation, bonuses, or advancement.
Yes, the concrete stuff. If an employee sees a high performer who is also known for cutting ethical corners, getting a big promotion, that survey score is going to plummet.
And the flip side is just as critical for establishing a genuine ethical environment: punishment.
Do employees believe that people who act unethically, even if they're high performers, will be appropriately punished? Is that punishment applied uniformly?
Things like diminished compensation, lack of advancement, or even termination.
Exactly. If employees see bad actors thriving or repeatedly escaping consequences, the entire ethical environment just collapses instantly. The policy is perceived as toothless.
And this brings us back to that psychological sophistication, the use of those crucial negative framed questions.
The ones designed specifically to reveal coercion and hidden pressure.
These questions are the gold standard for uncovering toxicity because they target that vulnerable manager-subordinate dynamic directly.
They're so direct.
They ask, in the last year, I have been asked by someone senior to me to take action that I consider to possibly be unethical or contrary to stated policies. It doesn't ask if you saw misconduct. It asks if you were pressured into it.
A huge difference. And that question is immediately followed by an essential perception check. I believe that in the past year, someone else in the company has been asked by someone senior to them to take action that would be considered unacceptable or unethical.
So it measures a perceived ethical climate, even if you haven't personally experienced it.
Yes. And if that widespread perception is high, it suggests a systemic cultural problem.
Right.
And that can reinforce or totally contradict a general positive statement like, for the most part, company management acts in an ethical manner.
So you look for the dissonance.
The dissonance between a positive general statement and a high perception of coercion score is a massive, massive red flag.
Okay, let's shift gears now to Principle 4, competence. This is all about whether employees are technically set up for success, if they're qualified to do their jobs, and if they're properly supported.
Competence evaluation has to start with clarity, definitional hygiene. The questions focus heavily on whether job responsibilities have been clearly communicated.
And whether the criteria used for assessing performance, the actual metrics, have been communicated.
Right. As the sources point out, you simply cannot be competent if you don't know precisely what you are supposed to be doing or how your success is being measured.
And tied to clarity is the quality of feedback.
Questions probe things like, the performance feedback I receive is delivered in a timely fashion, is fair and balanced, and helps me to practically improve and succeed in my role. That speaks directly to the quality of supervision, of mentorship, and the organization's real commitment to employee development.
Then they move into the more tangible tools for success.
This isn't just about training attendance. It's about access to timely, complete, and accurate information. Employees are asked if the information they need to execute their control responsibilities is available when they need it.
And if that information is consistently complete, accurate, and timely.
Yeah, a financial controller can't perform an accurate reconciliation if the underlying data is a day late or it's missing key transactional details. It's impossible.
And training effectiveness is assessed directly. It's not enough to ask if the employee sat through the mandatory 4-hour ethics video.
No. The question has to probe utility. The training I receive helps me execute my duties more effectively. They are looking for evidence that the training provided the specific mental models and tools needed to make a tough call when you're facing a real-world dilemma.
Furthermore, the questions probe resources and authority.
Our employees delegated the necessary decision-making authority they need to effectively perform their job, and, critically, for the most part, I have been provided with the resources necessary to perform my job effectively.
Including time, budget, and supervision.
All three. A systemic lack of resources often forces employees to implement workarounds or to take shortcuts that fundamentally compromise control procedures, even if the employee is well-meaning and trying to get the job done.
Finally, they wrap this section up with a general fairness perception check.
They ask if compensation and promotion policies seem fair and transparent.
Which might feel like a soft metric, but it's fundamentally tied to morale.
It's tied to morale, engagement, and most importantly, the willingness of that employee to rigorously adhere to control procedures when no one is watching. Unfairness breeds cynicism, and cynicism is poison for controls. So we've established the design phase. Now comes the crucial next step, the whole point of this exercise, analyzing and acting on the results.
The analysis imperative.
Yes. All the resources poured into survey design and distribution are just wasted unless the responses are properly analyzed, summarized, and crucially responded to. Survey time that leads to inaction is wasted time, and worse, it's a trust breaker.
Absolutely. You can't ask for feedback and then do nothing. So first, you establish the tabulation basics.
Management needs meticulous tracking. They have to record the total number of surveys distributed and the precise number returned.
And beyond that, they detail the quality of those returns, the number of fully completed, partially completed, and unusable responses.
They also perform stratified tracking. This means tracking the data by functional department, by employee level like salary bands or organizational tiers, and by physical location.
And that stratification is what allows them to spot patterns.
That's how you pinpoint where remediation resources need to go. Is the low competence score confined to the Asia-Pacific sales office, or is it systemic across all three global divisions?
Let's talk about the problem of unusable responses, because the practice aids highlight this as more than just an accounting error.
Right. Management should carefully consider how to handle improperly completed surveys, like ones with nonsensical answers, or maybe corrupted electronic data.
So what do you do with them?
Well, you need to tabulate the non-usable responses, both for the whole questionnaire and on a by-question basis. But here's the fascinating caveat. There may be significant hidden information value, even in the non-answers.
As so.
If you have a pattern of high non-response, let's say 50% of one department didn't reply, that indicates a need for immediate follow-up. The source material warns that in certain tainted environments, you might see deliberate attempts to subvert the surveys through organized non-response.
So a low response rate in a specific department could be just as revealing as a low score.
It could be even more revealing.
Wow. Okay, so when summarizing the quantitative data, how do they translate those 1 to 5 ratings into something actionable?
For the 1 to 5 opinion scale, they use standard statistical measures. This means computing things like the mean or average, the median, which is the middle value, and the mode, the most frequent response.
And visual aids, like bar charts.
Visuals are huge. A bar chart can show the distribution of responses from 1 to 5. Management is looking not just at the average, but at the spread. A high average with a large number of 1s and 5s, a bimodal distribution, that's way more concerning than a medium average where all the responses are clustered tightly around the 3.
And for the yes-no responses, it's just straightforward tabulation.
By question, yes. But you have to include a provision for unusable responses here too, just to make sure the denominator for your percentage calculation is accurate.
And what about all the written comments?
If you get a lot of comments and examples, they should be summarized separately, usually organized by question theme, from the objective numerical data. This just makes the review of the qualitative information less cumbersome during that initial quantitative assessment.
This brings us to a really crucial high-stakes part of this, the ethical balancing act when you're summarizing the data.
The analyst has to remain incredibly sensitive to that confidentiality promise, even as they're stratifying the results.
So how do you do that?
Sensitivity is absolutely required when summarizing data by location or department to prevent the clear identification of a specific respondent. This is a real dilemma for the analyst, and our sources recommend implementing strict minimum group size rules.
A minimum threshold, right?
Can you explain how that works in practice?
Certainly. So if you have a one-person sales office in Cincinnati and you summarize the data just for that office, you have instantly and unintentionally identified the respondent.
You've broken the promise.
You've broken the promise.
Yeah.
The general rule of thumb is often called the minimum threshold rule. Analysts will only report aggregated data for a group, a department, or a location if the response count, the N, for that group is above a predetermined threshold. Often it's N10 or N15.
And if it's below that?
If the count is below that, the data for that group must be merged into a broader regional or functional category until the threshold is met, even if management really wants that granular data.
So the analyst has sometimes sacrificed granularity to preserve the promise of anonymity. You have to. You're protecting the integrity of all future surveys. If management needs to add any other identifying information to the survey, say the employee's direct supervisor's name, they have to use very broad categories because they have to recognize that employees may feel this information could be used to identify them. The promise of confidentiality is sacred.
Now, what happens when the data contradicts itself? You get 90% agreement that the environment is great, but 5 written comments describe blatant, serious misconduct.
That is the essential importance of disconfirming evidence. Outlier responses and comments or examples that directly contradict the general sentiment cannot be ignored.
They might be the most valuable part.
They often are. They trigger information about policy awareness, employee attitudes, or hidden risks. If the comments contradict the general trend, those specific issues need to be flagged for further consideration, regardless of the overall high score.
And if those comments contain really serious accusations, explicit details of financial misconduct or harassment,
serious accusations, high-stakes issues, they may require immediate investigation. And this often means involving independent legal counsel or the external audit committee.
which present a massive dilemma.
A critical dilemma. A decision to try to identify the individual respondent to follow up on the accusation could completely destroy the trust management built for the entire entity. You have to weigh the promise of confidentiality against the fiduciary duty to investigate wrongdoing.
So how do entities usually resolve that? How do you address the accusation without burning the whole system down?
The best practice, as outlined in the aids, is to launch a broad investigation focusing on the alleged issue or department described, rather than trying to zero in on the respondent. They have to address the issue while preserving the integrity of the confidentiality contract.
So they might investigate an entire branch's controls or observe transactions in a specific division more closely based on the non-identifiable details provided.
Exactly.
Okay, let's talk about the so what of low scores. If the average rating on a critical control area like clarity of responsibilities is low, what does that indicate for the entity?
A low score in any one area may indicate a control deficiency, or potentially a material weakness in the system of internal control.
Which is a very serious term.
It's a term of art with legal implications. Our sources highlight that employees with significant control responsibilities for financial reporting say the person who reconciles cash daily must have clear knowledge of their responsibilities for that control procedure to be deemed effective. A low score on clarity or competence here is a major flag, and it impacts how the external auditor views the entire control system.
But I've heard this argument before, that weaknesses identified here might be compensated for by other controls. Is that a legitimate doubt?
It can sound like a convenient excuse to avoid fixing the root problem, and that's the risk. How does the source material guard against management being too quick to dismiss a critical survey score as compensated? That's the inherent risk, which is why the aids include a really strong warning. Yes, it's true that close supervision or, redundant control procedures that address the same control objective may adequately compensate for a lack of employee understanding of a particular procedure.
So, for example, if the employee in question is closely supervised and their work is reviewed 100% of the time by a manager who really understands the control, the immediate risk is lower.
It is. But the practice aid says not to dismiss the problem lightly.
Right.
Exactly. Management should not be too quick to just wipe away the problem without concrete evidence that the compensating or redundant procedure really works. The expert has to ask, why allow the deficiency to persist when communication, training, and education can often resolve the underlying issue more permanently and efficiently?
So the first reaction should be to fix the root cause.
Always. Don't just rely on a compensating control that might fail tomorrow.
So the surveys give us the quantitative data, the broad strokes of the attitude landscape. They tell us where the issues might be. But to truly validate whether controls are operating effectively and to understand why they might be failing, you have to go beyond the numbers.
You have to talk to people one-on-one. This is the realm of the walkthrough and the structured interview.
And these interviews, they offer a phenomenal opportunity. Our sources say it's to gather that control environment, confirming or disconfirming information directly from non-management personnel.
Often in a confidential one-on-one setting, which is key. They're essential for structuring follow-up evidence regarding the effective implementation of a specific transaction control, say, the accounts payable process.
And the interviewer has to be vigilant. They're watching carefully for signs of disconfirming information, for personnel taking on new duties without proper training, and for any latent problems that may have come up.
They're trying to capture two broad areas: design effectiveness, how the system is supposed to flow, and operating effectiveness. Is it actually flowing that way consistently?
Okay, let's start with design effectiveness.
Design effectiveness focuses heavily on the data input, the flow of information, and the points where a control is applied. The interview has to start with the basics of the employee's function. What documents or electronic files are necessary for you to do your job? Who do you get this information from? How do you access it?
You're basically mapping the process flow from the perspective of the person doing the work.
That's exactly it. And the quality check on that incoming information is crucial. You ask, is the information normally available on time and accurate? Have you encountered any problems with the completeness or accuracy of the information over the past year? This tests the upstream controls that feed the interviewee's function.
Then you map the process itself.
In what ways do you modify, combine, or change the data you receive? What happens to a file or document when you're finished with it? How do you signal that you've performed your function? Can I tell just by looking at the document or the system log that you completed your step?
So you're looking for an audit trail.
You have to have an audit trail. And embedded in that pathway are the specific control checks performed by the employee. What verification steps do you perform on the information to make sure it's accurate before you pass it on?
A critical line of questioning here is completeness.
Oh, absolutely. How does the employee ensure they received all the transactions they should have for a given period? And conversely, how do they make sure that no transactions accidentally get dropped from the process flow? You're probing for reconciliation or matching procedures.
The interviewer also needs to differentiate between manual checks and system controls.
You have to ask. When you're processing the information, what manual steps do you take to prevent errors? And then conversely, what controls are built into the system itself that automatically prevent errors?
Like fields that require specific data formats or mandatory approvals.
Exactly. And finally, validation. How does the employee know the transactions presented to them are legitimate, you ask? Are any pre-approvals necessary? Is there specific required documentation that must accompany this transaction before you process it? This confirms the existence of upstream authorization controls.
Okay, so that's the design. Now, operating effectiveness. This is less about the ideal system and more about the consistency and quality of applying that control day in and day out in the real world.
Consistency is often probed by asking about ambiguity or gaps. You ask employees, do you ever encounter situations where company policies for handling a transaction either do not exist or are unclear? How often does this happen?
And if they have encountered a situation with no clear policy, the critical follow-up is, what decision did you make and why did you choose that path?
That's how you identify the unofficial rules that really govern the organization.
The interviewer can also use this time for crowdsourcing control improvement.
It's a great opportunity. If you were in charge of designing policies, what simple changes would you make to improve both the effectiveness and the efficiency of your current process? The person doing the job often knows the most efficient fix.
The ultimate test of consistency and integrity, though, involves policy deviation. This is a crucial, high-stakes line of questioning.
It really is. When, if ever, is it okay to not follow written policies exactly? Have you ever been asked by anyone, your manager, or a peer to not follow policy?
And then the follow-up. If so, who asked you to do this and what was the justification?
That question immediately surfaces pressure points and potential control override issues within the organizational hierarchy.
You also look for uniformity across the same job function.
If there are others in the company with the same job functions as yours, do you think they perform the job in the same way? If you've observed differences, what are they and what causes these differences? This helps management identify training gaps, unofficial workarounds, or inconsistent cultural expectations.
And uniformity also includes continuity over time.
Have you performed these procedures consistently since the last annual evaluation? If you were unavailable, who took your place? What training did they receive? And have there been any recent changes to the procedures that haven't been documented?
Next, assessing qualifications and vulnerability is paramount. This gets into the employee's personal resources and fitness for the job, connecting directly back to Principle 4.
It starts with assessing training needs. You ask directly, do you feel adequately trained? And is that training updated sufficiently to enable you to perform all of your current duties?
But you also ask these forward-looking questions to reveal institutional memory gaps.
If you had to design the official training program for a new person starting your position, what essential topics would you be sure to include? How did you learn these things? Was it formal training? Or was it tribal knowledge from a colleague?
And what additional topics would you like to be trained in that would help you do your job even better?
This is an essential diagnostic tool for finding current training deficiencies and knowledge transfer breakdowns.
And then, the major structural red flag topic, incompatible responsibilities.
It's a technical term, but it is absolutely essential to fraud prevention.
It is a clear, relatable definition, our sources say. Incompatible responsibilities exist when one individual is in a position where they must both process data.
Like prepare invoices or input customer orders.
And check their own work for errors, and no one else checks their work.
The interviewers must ask if this has been observed in their department. Let's use a clear scenario. Imagine the person responsible for processing customer refunds is also the only person who receives and reconciles the daily bank statement.
I see the problem already.
Right. That single employee has the necessary access and the critical cover to issue fraudulent refunds to themselves or their friends, and then cover up the outgoing transaction during the reconciliation process. This dual role provides both the opportunity and the concealment. Interviewers have to probe if the employee has to review their own work.
Which leads us to the final and maybe most insightful element of the interview, the vulnerability assessment.
These are the probing, critical thinking questions about fraud potential. They effectively ask employees, how could someone break the system if they wanted to?
This technique is brilliant because it leverages the employee's intimate, ground-level knowledge of the process flow.
They know the shortcuts, they know the exceptions, the system blind spots, far better than any manager or auditor ever could.
So you ask directly. Suppose that someone was inclined to deliberately create an error in the financial reporting process. For example, by introducing a fictitious transaction or manipulating an input field. How could they do it without getting caught in the current system?
And you broaden the scope to asset protection, which can reveal major gaps in physical or system security. Which company assets are most vulnerable to employee theft or misappropriation?
And then, based on how we currently track things, how could these assets potentially disappear without someone finding out through a control or reconciliation process?
The answers to those questions give management immediate, actionable intelligence about security vulnerabilities that the existing documented controls often completely miss.
So once management has synthesized all this data, the quantitative scores from the survey, the qualitative comments, the granular interview insights from the walkthroughs, they have to transition into remediation.
But first, they require a comprehensive root cause analysis, RCA. If the responses point to issues like chronically insensitive management attitudes during routine oversight, you have to determine the underlying cause, not just treat the symptom.
Right. If the issue is, say, low morale linked to poor supervision, the root cause could be multi-layered. It might be that some managers are genuinely unaware of the negative effect their actions have on employees.
A lack of soft skills training.
Or, conversely, the manager might be an excellent coach, but they are critically overburdened with other responsibilities.
A lack of resources, which forces them to devote less time than necessary to effective, quality supervision and mentorship. The root cause analysis has to distinguish between a training problem and a resource allocation problem, because the fix is completely different.
And the sources outline clear, systematic, actionable changes if manager behavior needs correction. This isn't just about moving people around. It's about systematic intervention.
That intervention includes formal training tailored to the identified deficiencies, informal coaching or mentoring of managers by senior leadership or HR, strategic changes to the way the company provides incentives to its employees.
Rewarding ethical behavior and high-quality supervision.
And, crucially, the allocation of additional resources where the analysis confirms managers are just overburdened.
And this isn't just a feel-good HR exercise, it's an economic necessity.
Absolutely. Ignoring poor interpersonal skills or low morale generally results in significantly higher employee turnover, which is incredibly costly.
Studies consistently show that the cost of replacing one key employee, from recruitment fees to lost productivity during the ramp-up phase, can easily exceed 1.5 times that employee's annual salary.
So remediation is a necessary economic investment.
We also have to address highly specialized weaknesses, particularly those concerning financial reporting competence.
Our sources point out that a common and high-stakes weakness, especially in smaller or rapidly scaling private companies, is a lack of depth in the controllership or senior accounting officer positions.
Why is that role specifically so vulnerable?
Because the controller is the nexus point for financial controls. If the expertise isn't there, or if that one person is completely overwhelmed, the entire framework supporting external financial statements is compromised.
And while these issues can be overcome with more support, training, and supervision, such weaknesses have very serious implications for financial reporting quality.
They get identified as material weaknesses by external auditing standards. The mandate is clear. It is always better that the entity identify the potential deficiency, quantify the risk, and begin a proactive remediation program, rather than waiting for the independent external auditor to reach that negative conclusion first.
So once management identifies a possible control weakness through this whole process, they have to modify their assessment approach by following a rigorous 3-step remediation program.
Okay, step 1. Revise the control to become effective. Our sources stress, do this first. If the survey showed the procedure was unclear, rewrite it immediately. If the walkthrough revealed an incompatible responsibility, separate those duties today. You fix the faulty control procedure immediately, recognizing that there is an existing deficiency in the current period.
Okay, step 2. This is the historical cleanup, and it sounds like the most complex part from an auditing perspective. You have to expand the scope of internal and external auditor direct testing of the underlying data in the area affected by the control problem.
And this testing has to cover the entire period before the control procedure was fixed.
Why?
Because the weak control procedure may have allowed errors or even fraud to enter the system. The entity has to perform substantive testing of the data to identify any errors that were introduced during the time the control was broken. The external auditors will demand proof that this historical cleanup was rigorous and complete before they'll accept the remediation.
Okay, so let me get this straight. Step 1 is fix the hole in the boat.
Mm-hmm.
Step 2 is bail out all the water that got in.
That's a great way to put it.
And step 3 is to make sure the patch is holding.
Exactly. Step 3. Test to ensure the remediated control is effective. You need to gather evidence, often through a new walkthrough or a targeted internal audit, to verify that the fix actually fixed the problem and that the new control procedure is now operating consistently and as designed.
That closes the loop.
It closes the loop and transforms a documented weakness into confirmed auditable improvement. The whole process moves from assessing the subjective culture with surveys, to verifying the concrete operational system with walkthroughs, to finally addressing the deficiency with a structure that satisfies both management's need for efficiency and the auditor's need for verifiable compliance.
So this deep dive has really established that assessing an entity's control environment requires management to move far beyond just checking boxes on a compliance sheet.
You have to employ these highly confidential, psychologically sophisticated surveys to accurately gauge employee attitude and awareness.
And that quantitative snapshot has to be paired with detailed face-to-face walkthroughs and interviews designed not just to check if policies exist, but to probe for inconsistencies, to evaluate the system's design against real-world application.
And crucially, to test the consistency and quality of how personnel apply those controls.
The true enduring value of this entire process, though, it lies in management's responsiveness to the findings. I mean, while the initial purpose of the survey was to get a snapshot view for compliance, it would be a failure for management not to seize the opportunity to enhance awareness or create more positive, more ethical attitudes based on the responses they received.
Such visible actions, training managers based on low scores or fixing the incompatible responsibilities that the walkthrough identified, they provide confirming real-world evidence that management is responsive to identified issues and is committed to continuous improvement.
And that, ultimately, is the strongest control of all.
A culture of listening and corrective action.
And finally, we'll end with a provocative thought, drawn directly from the most insightful questions in these best practices. The source material highlights that the most vulnerable company assets might be those that employees, in a moment of refreshing candor during an anonymous interview, implicitly reveal through their suggestions on how things could disappear.
Consider this. When management is seeking knowledge about their own security, competence, and ethical vulnerabilities, sometimes the most profound and actionable insights come from systematically asking people how they would break the system,
rather than just asking if they follow the rules.
That question flips the script. It unlocks a level of operational honesty that no standard compliance audit focused only on adherence can ever achieve. It transforms the employee from a subject of an audit into a security consultant.
Knowledge gained is knowledge applied. Until the next deep dive, keep thinking critically about the systems around you.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take complex, essential architecture, in this case, the architecture of financial reliability, and translate it into clear, usable knowledge.
Today, we are really getting to the weeds. We're focusing on internal controls over financial reporting, or ICFR.
And this is the absolute bedrock of investor trust, isn't it?
It's everything. ICFR is the system that's designed to ensure every single number a company reports is accurate, it's reliable, and it's timely.
And when this system fails?
Well, the consequences are measured in billions, and it just erodes market confidence completely.
Exactly. So you, our listener, have sent us a serious stack of source material here. We have everything from the foundational COSO framework to the very specific rules and auditing standards, like the PCAOB's AS number 5.
And all of this material, it points to a crucial, and I think a pretty uncomfortable truth.
Which is?
Controls are going to fail. Flaws in the system they're inevitable.
So our mission today is to unpack that critical and often very subjective process that managers and auditors have to go through to assess the damage.
Yeah, we need to understand the criteria. How do practitioners classify a control failure? I mean, what makes something a simple, isolated exception that you just note down versus a catastrophic material weakness that you have to publicly disclose?
A weakness that means a failing grade on the entire system.
Right. And we should be clear, we are operating entirely within the framework that Sarbanes-Oxley, or SOX, and the COSO framework established.
These aren't just concepts for huge public companies anymore either.
No, not at all. This is the modern standard for financial stewardship. We see it in large nonprofits and governmental organizations. It's the new baseline.
And the key shift here is that we're not just looking for errors that have already happened. We're trying to predict potential errors.
It's pure risk assessment, just applied to accounting processes. So let's get started. I think we need to confront that first uncomfortable reality, the inevitability of failure.
Okay, let's unpack that, because I think For the average person, the assumption is that major corporations, especially the big ones, have these perfect airtight systems. They spend millions on ICFR compliance, so finding a flaw should be, I don't know, a really rare event.
That assumption is not just wrong, it's dangerously naive. Finding control deficiencies is not a rare problem.
It's a feature, not a bug.
It's a guaranteed feature of any complex operation. It is the cost of doing business, the natural outcome of scale, of complexity, and, human interaction.
And we have the data to back this up. Our source material cited this one really eye-opening study. It tracked the results of 76 audit engagements across 44 different entities over a 2-year period.
And what they found was just
a staggering 3,990 deficiencies.
Just think about that number, the sheer magnitude. Nearly 4,000 confirmed flaws in the very systems designed for financial integrity. And that was across a relatively small sample group.
It wasn't isolated either. The report found one single audit engagement that identified over 200 deficiencies in 1 year.
And these were sophisticated public entities. These aren't mom and pop shops. Yet their control landscape was just full of these measurable holes.
Which immediately highlights what our sources call the tip of the iceberg problem.
Right.
Because if the public hears about a material weakness, that's just what's visible. The vast majority of those 3,990 findings, the lesser flaws, the exceptions, the deficiencies, they get fixed quickly, or they're just deemed not severe enough to tell the public about.
They just disappear from the official record. And it masks the true operational noise that's happening just beneath the surface.
So that's why the job of the auditor and management is so difficult. You can't just focus on what has already surfaced.
You have to focus on what could surface.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the core, most difficult conceptual shift that drives this whole severity assessment.
The could factor.
The necessity of analyzing the could factor.
I see the paradox here, and it's something we really need to spend some time on. Let's say an auditor is doing their work, their substantive testing, and they find an actual error in the financial statements. A $10 million mistake.
Okay.
That obviously implies a control failed. The system broke somewhere.
Exactly. Finding an error almost always points back to a failure in a control. But here's the paradox. The reverse is not true. And this is where managers often get it wrong.
How so?
Not finding a substantive error in the financial data does not in any way imply that the underlying controls are effective, or even that they reliably exist.
Wait, let me challenge that for a second. If the books are clean, if the final output is right, why can't I, as the CFO, just say, see, the system is working?
Because the effectiveness of your internal controls has to be judged on their design and their operation, not just the output of the process during one limited time frame.
So you're saying I might just be lucky?
You might have honest, competent, highly diligent individuals running your accounting processes. They might be able to produce perfectly correct financial data and reports through, sheer effort, even in the complete absence of any formal, robust, or documented controls.
Ah, I get it now. So if I rely only on the clean outcome, I'm actually just relying on the competence and the character of a few specific people. And if they leave, or if they just have a bad day, the whole system collapses because the underlying reliable mechanism, the control itself, is either missing or broken.
That is the key shift. The assessment has to look beyond the dollar amount of any actual misstatements you find. It must instead assess the likelihood and the magnitude of potential misstatements that could result if that deficiency were to be fully exploited.
So you're grading the system's ability to withstand future shocks, not just its performance last quarter.
You're grading the resilience of the system.
That makes the process fundamentally about predictive risk, not just historical record keeping. And I recall the sources noting a common historical bias here.
Oh, there was definitely a common bias, especially in the early SOX implementation years. Studies show that both managers and frankly, a lot of auditors tended to link a severe deficiency only when a large actual misstatement was found.
They needed to see the smoking gun.
Exactly. But that limited view anchors the entire assessment to known failures, which is precisely what the SOX and COS framework was designed to prevent. You have to project risk forward, not just record the history of failure.
And as we're assessing that risk, we have to look at the mechanisms themselves, manual versus automated controls. Which one carries the higher risk profile in this kind of predictive environment?
Generally, manual controls are considered riskier, less reliable.
Why is that?
Our sources note the reason beautifully. We humans have our ups and downs. We introduce variability. We get tired at 4:30 in the afternoon. We get distracted by a meeting. We get complacent doing the same review for the thousandth time.
Consistency. That's the main vulnerability.
It's the primary vulnerability of any manual control.
And automated controls, the ones embedded in software and IT systems, they're the complete inverse of that human variability.
Absolutely. They will operate with perfect consistency. They'll execute exactly as programmed every single time. That's the upside.
But that same consistency is also the downside.
It's the downside. If they are programmed incorrectly, they will be consistently ineffective. They'll produce the exact same flawed output on every single transaction without fail.
And they can't think for themselves.
No. They often lack the ability to exercise sophisticated human judgment when a really unusual or complex situation comes up. That's something a human reviewer is designed to handle.
So if a process requires really sophisticated, subjective judgment, like, say, assessing the valuation of some complex financial instrument, relying only on an automated process could be a design deficiency in itself.
Precisely. Because it removes that essential human critical review layer. The nature of the control, whether it requires interpretation or just simple counting, that dictates whether automation is appropriate, and that dictates the inherent risk of the mechanism.
So, whether the problem is human error or flawed programming, we have a deficiency. But before we can even start to apply the metrics of severity, we have to know where the flaw came from. Was the blueprint wrong, or did the builder just mess up the execution?
That is the next key step. Distinguishing the two fundamental ways an internal control deficiency can arise. And this is detailed extensively in SEC guidance, and it aligns perfectly with COSO's requirement for controls to be both present and functioning.
Okay, so the two types.
A design deficiency versus an operating deficiency.
Let's start with the blueprint problem. Design deficiency.
A design deficiency basically means the control system, as it was conceived or documented, is just inadequate to meet the control objective. The risk isn't covered.
And this happens in a couple of ways.
Two main ways. The first is that a necessary control just doesn't exist at all. It's a complete blank spot in the system.
Give us a good example of a necessary but missing control.
Let's use a classic procurement risk example. If a company has absolutely no control, requiring review or approval of new vendors before they are added to the system and paid, that is a design deficiency.
Because the objective is to prevent what? Kickbacks, fraud.
Overbilling from shell companies. Without that initial control, you're basically inviting massive financial fraud. It's a structural flaw that invites abuse.
Okay, so that's a missing control. What's the second type of design deficiency?
The second way is when a control exists, but it's improperly designed. So even if the person or the system followed the procedure exactly as it was documented, the ultimate objective, preventing or detecting a material misstatement, would still not be met.
That's a more sophisticated kind of failure. Can you give an example of a control that exists but is just designed badly?
Sure. Consider a system where the control requires a supervisor to review the expense reports of their subordinates. Sounds good on paper, right? Seems pretty standard. But if that supervisor doesn't have the technical access or, the detailed transactional knowledge they need to actually spot inappropriate charges or suspicious patterns, then the control is improperly designed.
It's just a rubber stamp.
It's a rubber stamp. The objective, making sure expenses are valid, is not achieved, even when the supervisor signs off. The fault is with the design, not the supervisor's effort.
All right, now let's turn to the execution side. Operating deficiency. This feels more like it's about human failure or a breakdown in procedure.
It is. An operating deficiency exists when the control is perfectly designed. The blueprint is totally sound, but it's just not reliably operating as intended.
This is what an auditor finds when they're testing things.
Typically, yes. They look at the documentation, they see it's good control, but then they find it failed repeatedly. Maybe because the employee forgot to perform the check, or they did it incorrectly, and that led directly to an error or a potential error.
So the mechanism is sound, but the person running the mechanism is failing, either through negligence or just lack of focus.
Or, and our sources note this as well, the person performing the procedure lacks the necessary authority or the qualifications to do it effectively.
Ah.
Maybe the control requires an accountant with a certain certification to review complex estimates, but the person assigned to the task is an entry-level clerk. That clerk might initial the form, so there's evidence the control was performed, but they lack the competence to make the control effective.
So that failure gets classified as an operating deficiency.
Right. And it stems from a staffing or a training failure.
So once we've pinpointed the type of failure design or operation, we move to classification, which is really the heart of this deep dive. Our material shows a very clear continuum of severity.
Yeah, the continuum starts with the least severe isolated exceptions. These might not even qualify as a full-blown deficiency. Right. Then it moves up to deficiencies, then to significant deficiencies, or SDs, and finally the most severe material weaknesses, or the MWs.
And the really difficult part, as acknowledged by all the standard setters, is drawing the lines between those classes. When does a significant deficiency cross that threshold and become a material weakness?
That is the billion-dollar question. We need the formal definitions to anchor this discussion. Let's start at the top.
Material weakness.
The definition of a material weakness, or MW, is consistent across all the major guidance bodies. It is a deficiency or a combination of deficiencies such that there is a reasonable possibility that a material misstatement of the financial statements will not be prevented or detected on a timely basis.
Reasonable possibility and material misstatement. Those are the key phrases.
Those are the two pillars. And the consequence within the COSO structure is absolute. It's completely binary.
What do you mean?
If management concludes that even one unremediated material weakness exists in any COSO principle or component, they are precluded from assessing the overall system of internal control as effective.
So one MW means the whole system fails. Publicly.
Publicly disclosed failure, yes.
Okay, so a significant deficiency, an SD, sits just below that catastrophic level. How do we differentiate that?
An SD is defined as a deficiency or a combination of them that's less severe than an MW, yet it's important enough to merit attention by those responsible for oversight. So the board, the audit committee, senior management.
The definition sounds a little amorphous.
It is, and by necessity, it needs to cover a really wide spectrum of issues.
I do recall some of the historical guidance tried to put a more concrete number on that line, didn't it?
Yes, and this really helps illustrate the practical difficulty. In the early days of SOX, some practitioners adopted these arbitrary financial thresholds to help differentiate SDs from lesser deficiencies.
How did that work?
For instance, if planning materiality, the amount that the auditor thinks is large enough to influence a reader of the financials, was set at, say, $1 million.
Yeah.
Auditors might internally classify a potential misstatement exposure that's between, say, $200,000, so 20% of materiality, and $500,000 as a significant deficiency. Anything below that lower threshold might just be a lesser deficiency or an exception.
So if the deficiency could potentially cause a $350,000 error, you'd call it an SD. If it could cause a $1.2 million error, it's clearly an MW.
Exactly. Now, while those exact numerical rules aren't mandated today, they show the required thought process. SDs are serious enough that they have to be disclosed to governance. The board needs to know about this and manage the risk. But they are not severe enough on their own to trigger that required public admission of an ineffective system.
Ignoring an SD.
Ignoring an SD is itself a huge red flag for a poor control environment.
That gives us the definitions. Now we can dive into the core measurement tools used to evaluate this severity as the PCAOB laid out in AS number 5, likelihood and significance.
These are the two pillars. The first, reasonable possibility, relates to the likelihood that a financial misstatement will result from the control failure. The standard defines this as anything more than remote.
And the second?
The second, material, relates to the significance. That's the potential amount of misstatement that could result. And again, I have to stress, it's not about if a misstatement did occur, but if it could happen and how large it could be.
Okay, let's spend some significant time on likelihood. How do auditors and managers actually quantify reasonable possibility? It sounds like guesswork, but the standards demand a structured approach.
It requires deep situational knowledge. They consider several factors. They look at the nature of the accounts involved. For example, accounts that require complex estimates like pension liabilities, loan loss reserves, or complex revenue recognition for construction contracts, they inherently involve greater risk and subjectivity.
More so than something like routine payroll.
Exactly, or cash disbursements. If the control over a subjective account fails, the likelihood of a major misstatement is naturally higher.
And what about susceptibility to fraud? How does that play in?
That's a primary concern. The likelihood assessment has to weigh the susceptibility of the assets or liabilities involved to loss or fraud. Cash, easily transferable inventory, transactions with related parties. They are all inherently more susceptible. If a control deficiency exists around those areas, the likelihood of a material event just rises rapidly.
And the complexity of the process itself must play a role, too.
Absolutely. The more subjective or complex the input is, the higher the likelihood of a misstatement if the control fails. Conversely, if a deficiency relates to a really simple, highly objective process like just checking if a purchase order number is present, the likelihood is lower unless that deficiency is systematic.
We also have to consider the interaction with other controls. Redundancy.
This is critical. You have to ask, is this deficient control the only thing preventing a material error? If the control is highly redundant, meaning 2 or 3 other strong controls cover the exact same risk, then the failure of that one single control doesn't raise the likelihood of a material misstatement all that much.
But what if they interact in a bad way?
That's the flip side. If the deficiency interacts with other unrelated deficiencies that collectively impact the same financial statement assertion, like, say, the valuation of inventory, the likelihood assessment skyrockets.
The focus on future consequences is particularly insightful. It forces the assessor to be strategic, not just reactive.
It demands projection. Imagine a deficiency in a new software module that currently only handles, say, 5% of the business.
Okay.
If the business plan is to roll that module out to 80% of operations next year, what is a moderate deficiency today suddenly becomes a high likelihood candidate for a material weakness. Because the volume of exposed activity is about to multiply 15-fold. You have to grade the potential future impact.
Or, as you mentioned earlier, the fluctuating materiality threshold.
Yes. If the company had a massive high-profit year, the materiality threshold might be $2 million. A $1.5 million risk exposure from a control failure is an SD. But if the company forecasts a lean year next year, dropping that materiality threshold to just $500,000, that same $1.5 million exposure is now 3 times the material threshold.
So you have to factor in next year's budget.
Auditors and management must factor in projected financial results when they're assessing the longevity and potential severity of a deficiency.
And in some extreme cases, the likelihood assessment effectively becomes 100%.
That's when you have conclusive evidence. If an actual material misstatement is identified during the audit, that is the realization of the risk. It confirms a 100% control failure.
There's no more it did.
Right. And similarly, if an important necessary control is entirely missing a pure design deficiency, you have to assume a 100% likelihood of failure. Because a control doesn't even exist to miss the error. You can't just rely on luck.
All right, let's shift to significance, the magnitude. This is about quantifying the potential dollar impact.
This focuses directly on the financial amounts or the total volume of transactions that are exposed to the deficiency. Auditors use their professional judgment and estimation techniques to determine the maximum potential misstatement amount that could result from the failure.
This calculation sounds straightforward until you bring in that conundrum of overstatement versus understatement risk. That cash example you flagged is a perfect illustration of how misleading the balance sheet can be when you're assessing exposure.
It is one of the most conceptually difficult points for practitioners to grasp. Let's walk through it slowly. We'll use the example of cash.
Okay. Let's assume the company reports its cash balance on the balance sheet as $10,000.
Okay. So if the deficiency relates to the overstatement of cash, say, controls fail and someone is inflating the balance, the maximum possible misstatement is $10,000.
Why?
Because the cash balance cannot drop below zero. The recorded balance acts as a natural cap on the overstatement risk.
That makes perfect sense. My exposure for overstatement is capped by the number I actually report.
But now, let's consider the magnitude relating to an understatement risk. Say the controls failed and large amounts of cash were completely omitted or accidentally misclassified. If the company's true cash balance was actually $50,000, but they only reported $10,000.
Then the misstatement is $40,000.
Yes, the misstatement is $40,000.
Wait a minute. The potential misstatement, $40,000, is 4 times larger than the balance reported on the books, which was only $10,000.
That is the critical distinction. For understatement risk, the reported balance provides an indication of potential significance, but it absolutely does not define the magnitude. The potential harm from a failure that causes an understatement is capped only by the true underlying value of the accounts and the total transaction volume exposed.
So if a control over issuing new debt fails,
the potential understatement of liabilities is functionally limitless. It just depends on the volume of borrowing activity.
So the assessor can't just look at the static year-end balance. They have to analyze the flow, the total volume of dollars moving through that control point over the entire year to understand the full gross dollar exposure to the deficiency.
Exactly. If a deficiency affects accounts that process massive volumes of activity, even if the year-end balance looks modest, the significance assessment could lead directly to a material weakness classification, all because of the exposure to a huge potential high statement. This analysis of flow versus static balance is foundational to a robust magnitude assessment.
Speaking of high significance, the auditing standards don't leave everything up to this detailed quantitative measurement. They explicitly highlight specific catastrophic failures that act as huge, undeniable red flags.
Yes, the special deficiencies.
What, all right?
These are the conditions that signal a systemic decay, regardless of the immediate quantified dollar impact. These conditions are considered strong indicators of a material weakness. And while there is, a tiny bit of technical wiggle room for management to argue for a downgrade,
In reality,
the practical reality is that few audit committees would ever accept classifying these conditions as anything less than an MW.
let's detail these core 4 high-priority indicators. Number 1 addresses the very foundation of the organization.
Identification of fraud. And I need to stress this, whether or not it's material in dollar amount on the part of senior management.
Why is that so critical?
This is a poison pill for the entire control system. The whole system starts with the tone at the top, which is the cornerstone of the COSO control environment component. If your senior management, your CFO, CEO, COO, is willing to commit fraud, even small expense fraud, it demonstrates a complete breakdown of integrity and ethics that no amount of lower-level controls can ever overcome.
It signals a fundamental collapse of the control environment.
It does. The system is only as good as the people at the top are honest.
Okay, number 2. Restatement.
A restatement of previously issued financial statements to correct a material misstatement. If the entity has to publicly withdraw its previous financial report and say, we were wrong, here are the real numbers, that is nearly irrefutable evidence that the ICFR failed to prevent or detect that error on a timely basis.
It's definitive proof of a past control failure.
It is. The only time a restatement isn't an MW indicator is if it's due to a mandatory change in accounting principles, which isn't a control failure.
Number 3 is a bit more subtle, but it's critical. A material misstatement that is identified by the auditor.
Yes. The identification of a material misstatement in the current period that the company's own ICFR would not have detected. And this is a crucial distinction. The external auditor is not a part of the company's internal control system.
Their job is to test the controls.
Their job is to test the controls. So if the auditor finds a mistake that management's existing controls missed, and that mistake is material, that means the controls failed their primary objective.
The company is supposed to prepare GAAP financials, and if the system can't reliably do that without the external auditor catching the big mistakes, then the system is ineffective.
Correct. The controls failed. It doesn't matter that the error was corrected before the report went out. The correction is immaterial to the assessment of the control failure. The failure happened, and you can't retroactively fix it.
And finally, a breakdown in the governance structure itself.
Ineffective oversight of financial reporting by the audit committee or the governance body. This maps directly to the COSO monitoring component. The audit committee is responsible for monitoring management, for challenging their judgments, and for overseeing the financial reporting process.
So if they're asleep at the wheel,
If the audit committee is asleep at the wheel, if they lack the expertise, or if they are just indifferent to reported concerns, the entire supervisory structure is compromised. You cannot have effective controls without effective monitoring.
beyond these 4 massive red flags, the source material listed other severe deficiencies that, while maybe not automatic MWs, still demand high priority attention.
Yes. For example, insufficient in-house accounting expertise. This is a perpetual challenge, particularly for smaller entities that just can't afford a deep bench of highly technical accountants. If management can't properly research and apply complex GAAP or IFRS rules, that is a severe design failure that guarantees future material misstatements.
And what about process flaws around the crucial year-end period?
Inadequate design over the period-end closing process. This is where the highest risk, most complex transactions happen. Accruals, complex revenue recognition, depreciation calculations, estimates. A lack of specific, well-designed controls in this critical phase is just a recipe for error.
And the last one.
An attitude of indifference toward correcting known significant deficiencies. If the audit committee knows about SDs and they just shrug them off, that indifference points right back to a failure in the control environment itself, a fundamental lack of commitment to competence and control.
So that sets an extremely high bar. If any of those major red flags are present, the default stance has to be material weakness, forcing management to dedicate maximum resources to fixing it. Let's transition now to an area that often adds a lot of confusion to this severity assessment. Information Technology General Controls, or ITGCs. These controls cover things like security, access, program changes. Why are they assessed differently than, say, the controls over fixed asset accounting?
The difference is really historical theory about causation. Historically, the theory has been that ITGC deficiencies don't cause misstatements directly.
They're enablers.
They're enablers. They only create the conditions. They allow for the irregular or ineffective operation of the underlying application controls.
And application controls are the specific programmed processes that actually handle financial transactions, calculating payroll, validating customer limits, checking pricing data.
Exactly. So under the traditional view, if your security, which is an ITGC, was weak, that was bad. But it only became a material weakness if that weak security then resulted in a material application control failure.
So, for example, an unauthorized person changing the sales tax rate in the system, leading to a material misstatement of revenue.
Right. The severity of the ITGC deficiency was dictated by the severity of the underlying application deficiencies it enabled. If you had terrible physical access controls in your server room, but no fraud happened that year, the deficiency might be minimized.
That sounds risky.
It was. It's what we call the barn doors wide open problem. This approach fundamentally denigrates the importance of ITGCs because it relies on the hope that if the system is vulnerable, no one will actually exploit that vulnerability, or that the application controls will somehow survive.
But if the metaphorical barn door is wide open, if security and access controls are severely deficient, it means unauthorized people can get in, commit mischief, maybe even write new code, and then cover their tracks. They could escape detection by any of the existing application controls.
The risk is far more direct than that old theory implied. And the live-in case study from our sources gives us a powerful, frankly chilling example of exactly how that mechanism works.
Tell us more about the SEC v. Levant case.
Levant was a major theatrical production company, and the core issue was that senior management was perpetrating massive financial fraud. They were manipulating expense costs, hiding losses, managing earnings.
And how did they do it?
The mechanism of the fraud relied entirely on the lack of control over their IT systems. The management team had unrestricted access to the core accounting system.
So how did that lax access control enable the fraud itself?
The fraudsters were able to manipulate general ledger files directly, and crucially, they wrote and ran special programs, completely unauthorized code, to track two sets of books at the same time.
The real records and the bogus records.
The real records and the bogus records for the auditors. They would constantly transfer costs to hide losses when the auditors were around, and then they would just restore the records later.
So the fraud wasn't a failure of a simple application control. It was a systemic failure enabled by the ITGC, failure to control who could write and run code, and who could manipulate data files at will.
Precisely. If strong ITGCs had been in place, requiring strict change management, restricting who could write custom code, ensuring robust monitoring of access to sensitive data files, the entire scheme would have been stopped immediately.
And that case, along with the growing threat of cybersecurity, has forced a major conceptual shift in how we view ITGC severity.
It has. And that shift is solidified in the COSO 2013 framework.
How so?
The 2013 COSO framework now explicitly identifies effective ITGCs as a necessary principle. Principle 11 for effective internal controls. This elevates their status dramatically. The contemporary view holds that a material weakness arising from a severe ITGC deficiency, like lax security or a wide-open change management process, should now logically preclude an effective control assessment.
Even in the absence of a currently identified application failure.
Even then, you cannot assess the integrity of the books if you cannot trust the integrity of the system running the books.
The inherent risk is just too high.
It's too high for a prudent official to ignore. If you know security is terrible, you cannot reasonably assert that the financial data generated by that system is reliable. The best answer here is immediate priority remediation, not a debate over classification.
Okay, so before we move into the final review mechanisms, we need to address the concept that can sometimes pull a potential material weakness back from the brink, the concept of compensating controls.
Yes, these are often viewed as the system's safety net. When an identified deficiency meets the likelihood and materiality criteria, it's a potential MW. But if a compensating control exists, it can mitigate or lessen that risk and potentially downgrade the severity of the deficiency.
So how are compensating controls formally defined within the framework?
A compensating control is one that achieves the same objective as a missing or ineffective control. And by doing that, it reduces the overall risk of a material misstatement to an acceptable level.
Yeah.
They don't fix the original control failure, but they provide an acceptable backup measure.
Let's use a robust example to illustrate this mitigation.
Okay, let's go back to that vendor selection problem, the preventive control failure, where an employee can order from a non-approved vendor. That's a deficiency risking fraudulent expenses.
Right.
A compensating control might be a strong detective control that's performed later in the process. For instance, a mandatory monthly analytical review performed by a high-level manager, comparing actual procurement spend versus the budget and flagging any variances over, say, 5%.
So that detective control doesn't prevent the fraudulent transaction from happening, but it does detect it after the fact, hopefully before the financial statements are issued.
Exactly. The detective control compensates for the ineffective preventive control. If that detective control is robust, timely, and precise enough, it limits the magnitude of the exposed financial risk to an acceptable level. The original failure might stay in SD, but it might not aggregate up to an MW if that compensatory control is effective.
But the critique we often hear is, isn't a compensating control just an elaborate excuse for not fixing the poor design in the first place? How do we make sure auditors aren't just papering over a gap?
That is an essential critical question. And the source material issues a major warning based on early SOX experience. Compensating controls, especially high-level monitoring controls, were frequently cited, but often overestimated in their precision.
They look good on paper, but fail in practice.
Exactly. Very few controls, particularly high-level detective controls, are truly precise enough to fully mitigate the failure of a lower-level, highly specific control. If the original control failure meant a potential $2 million error, the compensating control has to be precise enough to detect or prevent $2 million worth of errors with very high reliability.
So it has to be tested just as rigorously.
Absolutely. To rely on a compensating control, its design must be formally evaluated. Does it cover the right assertion? Is it at the right level of detail? And its operating effectiveness has to be rigorously tested and observed by the auditor. If past misstatements have slipped through that supposed compensating control, reliance is impossible. The standards demand precision, not wishful thinking.
So after the auditor has measured likelihood, calculated significance, accounted for the IT environment, and considered all the compensating factors, there's one final, crucial reality check before the severity determination is finalized.
The prudent official test.
What is that?
This is the subjective check that prevents technical analysis from yielding an absurd result. It's directed by auditor and SEC guidance and requires stepping back from all the details. The manager or the auditor has to ask, would a prudent official, having the same knowledge of facts and circumstances that I have, agree with my determination?
That injects common sense and accountability. It forces the practitioner to think about how their conclusion would be viewed under public scrutiny.
It acts as an absolute gate against implausible conclusions. And the source material provided a chilling, vivid example of a conclusion that failed this test so spectacularly it became a national news story.
Walk us through that story.
This was a case where an audit team was reviewing controls, and they identified just a shocking level of failure. They found 35 separate deficiencies and errors in a sample of only 58 items tested.
That's a failure rate of over 60%.
Over 60%. Despite this overwhelming evidence of chaos and breakdown, the audit conclusion was that the balance in the overall controls were fine.
How could they possibly justify that?
The rationale was that each deficiency supposedly had a different, unique, and minor reason, which prevented them from being aggregated.
That is the ultimate rationalization.
It is. The conclusion that the system was fine after identifying flaws in over half the items you tested is just. It's indefensible. A non-accountant reading that story in the Wall Street Journal would instantly recognize that the judgment was flawed.
And the prudent official test is designed to stop that kind of tunnel vision.
Exactly, to ensure that the technical, detailed analysis hasn't obscured the obvious overarching reality. A system that's breaking down 60% of the time is not fine.
That principle is invaluable. If you can't defend the conclusion to a reasonably informed public observer, you need to reclassify the severity. Okay, we've established how to assess a single deficiency. Now we have to turn to the complexity of real-world organizations. What happens when you have dozens, maybe hundreds, of lesser issues spread across various departments? This is the critical concept of aggregation.
Aggregation is the recognition that numerous smaller deficiencies, which individually are classified as only deficiencies or maybe significant deficiencies, can combine to meet the definition of a material weakness. You can't assess these failures in isolation.
So how do these disparate issues accumulate?
They accumulate if they're concentrated in areas that share risk. For example, you might have multiple SDs that all affect a single account, like inventory. One SD might relate to counting, another to valuation assumptions, a third to documentation transfers. Individually, they're SDs, but when you combine them, the total exposure to misstatement in inventory now exceeds the material threshold.
Or they can aggregate by assertion, if they affect the same underlying objective of the financial statement.
Correct. Consider the existence assertion for revenue. One deficiency might be a lack of separation of duties and billing, and another might be a failure to reconcile shipping documents to invoices. If those two deficiencies are active at the same time, they collectively create a reasonable possibility that revenue that does not exist will be recorded materially.
This is that structural concept of death by 1,000 small cuts.
That's exactly what it is.
Given the earlier statistics where some engagements found over 500 deficiencies, the risk of accumulation must be constant, forcing a material weakness classification.
It is. If you have a carnival of problems spread across multiple functions, an issue in IT, an issue in HR regarding competence, an issue in the period-end close process, even if they are individually graded as simple deficiencies, a prudent official viewing the total chaos has to conclude the system is fundamentally broken.
And the COSO framework encourages this.
It explicitly encourages this integrated view. It challenges managers to link and relate deficiencies across components. A failure in the information and communication component, like untimeliness of reports, immediately impacts the monitoring and risk assessment components, which aggregates the failure vertically.
Our source material highlighted two persistent, common deficiencies that, while they sound mundane, often fuel this aggregation process: inadequate documentation and inadequate evidence of performance.
These are often low-cost fixes, but their neglect creates pervasive risk. Inadequate documentation is the most fundamental design failure you can have. Without a robust current accounting and procedures manual, consistency is impossible, especially with high staff turnover.
This reminds me of the analogy the source material used, the parlor game.
It's a perfect analogy. Procedures passed orally from person to person over time inevitably mutate. A key policy about revenue recognition that was clearly communicated by the CFO 5 years ago might, after passing through 3 different analysts, become something completely different and uncontrolled.
Oral policies migrate and morph.
They do, which is why documentation is considered a minimum threshold for effective controls. Lack of documentation is a failure to properly design the control system, and it paves the way for operational failure.
And the lack of evidence of performance must be an absolute nightmare for auditors.
It is. Conceptually, CSO accepts that a control can operate without inherently leaving evidence. But auditors need to see confirmation. They're very uncomfortable relying on something they cannot verify.
So if a control happens but leaves no trace,
No signature, no timestamp, no system log, then the entity has to spend significant time and money performing extended procedures, observation, and inquiry just to try and satisfy the auditor that the control actually happened.
and what's the simple solution to that inadequate evidence?
The fix is so simple and cost-effective. Mandate evidence creation. Simple steps like initialing and dating a bank reconciliation, using a system timestamp for critical approvals, or ensuring system logs capture user IDs for data changes. That provides the necessary objective evidence of performance by an authorized person. And it dramatically reduces audit time and cost down the line by creating a reliable audit trail.
Let's look at the long-term perspective. The data we have covers 2004 to 2009. Have organizations learned from this costly compliance process, or do the same problems just keep resurfacing?
The study examining deficiencies over time showed a pretty disturbing pattern. While overall experience improved some areas, entities are generally better at things like segregating duties now. Many weakness types remain sticky in proportion. They resist remediation efforts.
What are those persistent, sticky deficiencies?
Issues like deficiencies in accounting documentation, the period-end close process, especially around complex accruals and estimates, IT and security failures, and general journal entry controls. They persist with remarkable consistency.
So despite years of focus
And increased regulatory pressure, certain process areas remain perpetually vulnerable. And worse, The study showed increases in the frequency of ethical and senior management types of weaknesses, which suggests that the fundamental tone at the top, the control environment, is not improving as much as we had hoped.
Which brings us back to the overall conclusion regarding effectiveness. If a company finds 50 significant deficiencies and fixes 49 of them, but one lingers and aggregates into a material weakness, is the system effective?
No. The overall assessment is non-negotiable, and it's binary. A conclusion of ineffective controls arises if a material weakness exists in any COSO component control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, or monitoring, or in any of the 17 underlying principles, or if controls are not implemented in an integrated fashion.
So you need a passing grade on all parts of the COSO assessment to pass. The weakest link defines the entire strength of the chain.
There is zero room for nuance here. You cannot issue an effective except for the material weakness in accounts receivable opinion. If you have an MW anywhere, the system is ineffective. And this just reinforces the core concept that ICFR has to be viewed as an integrated, holistic system where a failure in one foundational element compromises the integrity of the whole.
This has been an incredibly detailed and I think essential deep dive into a topic that, while technical, really touches on the integrity of every number we rely on in the financial markets.
Indeed. The critical takeaway for you, our listener, is that assessing control severity is fundamentally a predictive risk management exercise. It relies far less on the actual historical errors an entity has made, and far more on the forward-looking assessment of the potential for a material misstatement, that careful analysis of likelihood and magnitude.
And the ultimate goal is not to minimize the number of reported deficiencies for appearance's sake, but to apply these severity criteria to correctly prioritize remediation. You have to fix the things that could kill the company first.
Precisely. The cost of fixing a material weakness early is invariably less than the cost of a higher-priced audit, an extended and costly external review, or, worst of all, the public disclosure and loss of trust that follows a restatement. The severity assessment provides the necessary roadmap for strategic prioritization.
And here's where it gets really interesting, and a final thought to leave you with, building directly on the data we discussed. Early SOX implementation studies found that when grading their own homework, public companies significantly underrated the severity of the deficiencies they identified, over 70% of the time.
That is a massive gap.
It points to a huge inherent human bias when management is assessing its own system.
That gap between management's assessment and the auditor's assessment is just stark.
So given that powerful tendency towards self-justification, what structural control mechanism could an organization implement internally to remove that inherent human bias and ensure a truly objective severity assessment when it's grading its own system of internal controls?
That is an excellent, challenging question for all organizations. How do you force yourself to see the risk objectively, even when the financial results look clean?
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the inevitable failures and the critical assessments of internal controls. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Our mission here is to tackle these incredibly complex, jargon-heavy, professional frameworks, the things that keep CFOs up at night, and really just break them down.
Break them down so that you, the listener, get the shortcut to being, really well-informed.
Exactly. So you don't just understand the answer, you actually understand the question being asked in the first place.
And today, we are immersing ourselves in what I'd call the absolute core of financial integrity. It's risk assessment within internal control over financial reporting, or ICFR.
Okay, ICFR. So let's paint a picture. Imagine this massive, complex machine, right? It's running millions of transactions every single day.
Right. And when a component in that machine fails, say a control is executed incorrectly or a simple check is missed, how do the people, responsible management, auditors, how do they definitively measure the potential damage?
It's not simple. It sounds like a mix of financial forensics and emergency room triage. You can't just look at a failure and say, oh, that was bad.
You can't. You have to categorize it. Precisely.
Wrong.
Is this a minor operational hiccup? Is it a serious warning sign for the board of directors?
Or is it a catastrophic system breakdown that could compromise the entire financial statement?
Exactly. And that rigorous process of classification, that's the difference between a little footnote in an internal report and the dreaded material weakness designation.
Right. And that's the one that signals to the entire market, to investors, that the company's financial reporting might be, unreliable.
And making that call, that classification, it requires intense, subjective, but also very structured professional judgment.
So that's our deep dive today. We're focusing on the structured thought process that auditors and management have to use to apply that judgment. We are going to dissect a really comprehensive framework designed specifically to evaluate these control exceptions and deficiencies.
And the lineage of this framework is, I think, critical to understanding its authority. This isn't just theory someone cooked up. It's an adaptation and a revision of a 2004 consensus document. And is originally developed by representatives from 9 major auditing firms.
We're talking the big ones.
Oh yeah, the Big Four, plus Grant Thornton, BDO Seidman, a whole list of others. And they worked alongside Professor William F. Messier, Jr. from Georgia State University.
So what we're looking at is basically the synthesized best practices of pretty much the entire auditing industry. This is the expert consensus on how you interpret the letter of the law.
Right. Which, in the U.S. context, that law often comes from documents like the PCAOB's Auditing Standard Number 5.
Okay, so let's connect those two for a second. PCAOB AS5 is the rule book.
That's a great way to put it. AS5 is the blueprint for conducting an integrated audit. It defines what an internal control failure is. But this framework we're discussing today, this provides the how-to manual.
Ah, okay.
It takes that abstract legal standard and turns it into an iterative, step-by-step decision tree that you can actually follow.
And for you, the listener, whether you're a regulator or a finance leader trying to build a resilient system, or even an investor just trying to understand why a company suddenly disclosed a material weakness, this deep dive, it cuts right through all that specialized jargon.
It really reveals the often complicated judgmental steps that are required to classify these failures.
And it gives you a deep, practical understanding of what financial control integrity truly means.
All right, let's get into it.
Okay, so let's start with the big picture, the meta-level concepts that govern this whole framework. They don't just jump straight into charts and boxes. They actually start with a kind of philosophy.
They do. And the first point is a massive disclaimer, essentially, about human judgment.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's crucial.
Yeah.
The framework begins by stating, and this is almost a direct quote, that it is only a suggested thought process. It's designed to assist knowledgeable and experienced individuals.
So it's a guide, not a robot.
Exactly. It explicitly warns that just mechanically applying the steps alone will not guarantee the correct conclusion. You cannot delegate the really difficult work of professional judgment to a spreadsheet or a checklist.
That immediately highlights this inherent tension, doesn't it? We all want objectivity, we want quantifiable metrics, but the system is just so complex that the final call still rests on an individual's accumulated experience.
It has to, because the environment is constantly changing and the evaluation itself is inherently iterative.
Iterative. What does that mean in this context?
It means you're constantly circling back. You might be deep into an audit, you classify a minor exception you found, and then 3 weeks later, you stumble on a new piece of evidence. Maybe it's an email trail.
And that email reveals the first exception wasn't just a one-off error.
Right. It reveals it was part of a systematic pattern of, say, management overriding a control on purpose.
Wow. So if that new information surfaces, your initial evaluation of that minor exception has to be completely revisited.
Completely. And it could potentially escalate it from a simple deficiency all the way up to a material weakness. The process, it never truly locks down until the financial statements are finalized.
So it's dynamic, not static.
Precisely. And that dynamism brings us to the 2 core dimensions we have to consider for every single failure, likelihood and magnitude. That's the formal recognition of this quantitative versus qualitative divide.
Okay, let's break down that divide. What are we looking for on the quantitative side?
The quantitative side is the hard dollar question. Will the misstatements that your internal controls fail to prevent or fail to detect have a material effect on the financial statements? You're trying to estimate the dollar exposure from that control failure.
It goes simple enough. But what about the qualitative side? Because sometimes a dollar amount, even if it's small, can still, sink a company's reputation.
Absolutely. And the framework gets that.
Yeah.
The qualitative consideration, it steps back and it assesses materiality based on the needs of, and they call them reasonable persons, relying on the information.
An investor, for example.
An investor, a lender, a regulator. So, for example, a $50,000 misstatement might be quantitatively immaterial to a $10 billion company. Just a rounding error.
Right.
However, if that misstatement is the result of known employee fraud, it becomes qualitatively material.
Because it's not about the $50,000 anymore.
Exactly. It speaks directly to the control environment, to management's integrity. The framework acknowledges that certain types of failure, like those involving, say, related party transactions or non-compliance, they just carry a weight that is far beyond their immediate monetary value.
There's a really mind-bending mathematical detail in the framework that highlights this complexity. It's this critical distinction they make regarding misstatement limits.
Ah, yes. The ceiling on overstatement versus the lack of a ceiling on understatement.
Yeah, explain that. Why is that distinction such a fundamental risk factor?
It's just pure accounting reality. Let's say you have an asset account, like accounts receivable, with a balance of $50 million. The most you can possibly misstate that account through overstatement is $50 million. If you record more assets than actually exist, you eventually hit a natural floor at zero.
Right. You can't claim you have negative receivables. It doesn't make sense.
It doesn't. But now consider a liability account.
Yeah.
Let's say you fail to record a massive new pension obligation or a contingent legal liability from a lawsuit.
So the recorded balance might be zero.
Right. But the potential understatement of that liability is, in theory, unlimited. It's constrained only by the size of the underlying transaction or the risk. If the company is facing a $2 billion lawsuit that should have been disclosed as a liability and it wasn't, the understatement risk is $2 billion against a recorded balance of zero.
So when auditors are looking at a control failure related to recording liabilities, the potential magnitude is just way scarier.
Much scarier, because the downside exposure isn't capped by the current balance. And that requires extreme caution when you're evaluating controls over things like accruals and contingent liabilities.
The risk profile is asymmetric. That's a great way to think about it.
And the framework forces the evaluator to acknowledge that asymmetry.
Okay, so now let's define the three core terms we'll be using throughout this deep dive. This is the classification spectrum of failure, moving from least severe to most severe.
Right. First, we have the most common finding, the control deficiency. This is your baseline failure. It's defined as a deficiency in the design or the operation of a control,
Okay.
where management or employees cannot prevent or detect misstatements on a timely basis. It's a gap.
And we break that down into two types, which I find really helpful: design versus operation.
Yes, a design deficiency is a structural flaw. It means the necessary control objective is just missing. Maybe no one is even assigned to reconcile the bank account.
Or the control that exists is just poorly conceived.
Exactly. If I design a review process, but I only require the reviewer to spot check one transaction out of 1,000, that control is just poorly designed to catch a material misstatement.
So it operates perfectly as it was designed, but the design itself is the problem. It's inadequate.
Correct. On the other hand, an operation deficiency is a performance failure. The control is beautifully designed. It's the perfect lock, but it fails in execution.
Someone just didn't do their job.
Either the control is not operating as it was designed, the reviewer just skipped the review entirely that month, or, and this is a critical point, the person performing it lacks the necessary authority or qualifications.
So you can't just put an intern in charge of reviewing complex tax provisions and expect it to work.
You can't. Even if the policy says reviewer A must review the tax provision. If reviewer A isn't qualified, it's an operating deficiency.
Okay. Moving up the severity ladder, we hit the significant deficiency. What makes this level of failure so significant?
The definition is comparative. It's less severe than a material weakness, but it's important enough to merit attention by those charged with governance.
So the board of directors, the audit committee.
Exactly. Think of it as a mandatory executive briefing item. It's not a full-blown systemic failure yet, but it indicates a really serious flaw in process integrity that, if you don't address it, could easily escalate.
So this is the warning light flashing on the dashboard. It's not on fire, but you better pull over.
That's the perfect analogy. If we find that the control deficiency is in an area of high judgment, or it involves a high-risk account, it often lands here, even if the dollar exposure is, borderline.
And finally, the conclusion that no CFO ever wants to face: the material weakness.
This is the pinnacle of failure in ICFR. It is a deficiency or a combination of them where there is a reasonable possibility that a material misstatement of the financial statements will not be prevented or detected and corrected on a timely basis.
I want to focus on that threshold, reasonable possibility. If I'm a layperson, reasonable possibility sounds like it could be, 50% or maybe 15%. How do you contextualize that?
Well, auditors and regulators rely heavily on professional standards here. The term reasonable possibility is generally considered a pretty low threshold for the likelihood of something occurring.
Lower than you'd think.
Much lower. It's significantly higher than remote, which basically means a slight chance, almost no chance. If something is reasonably possible, it implies the event's chance of happening is more than remote.
That is not a high bar.
Not at all. And critically, if the impact, the magnitude, is material, even a low probability event that is more than remote has to be classified as a material weakness. The system has failed its primary duty, which is ensuring reliability.
So the standard is basically saying if there is any non-negligible chance of a catastrophe, you have to report the weakness that allows for it.
That's it.
Okay.
And this entire framework is built to guide us through proving whether that reasonable possibility threshold has been crossed.
Okay, so let's start that journey. We begin with chart 1. This is the first filter, right?
It is. This is the initial filter that takes the raw data, the exceptions you find during testing, and determines if they are even significant enough to be escalated as a formal control deficiency.
And the baseline assumption here is that we're typically testing controls related to significant financial processes and, material accounts. So you can't just dismiss any exception you find.
That's the starting posture, yeah. Box 1 in the chart requires us to examine and understand the cause and results of exceptions. You have to evaluate every single one, both quantitatively and qualitatively.
So it's the why behind the failure.
It's everything. If the exception was a simple typo caused by a known human error during a really stressful quarter-end close, that's one thing. If the exception was a system failure because of improperly patched software, that's a whole other, much more systematic problem.
So we're trying to answer the question, did the test objective, did the control actually meet its goal of ensuring financial reporting accuracy?
That's the core question.
What are the key indicators that the objective was not met?
The framework gives some pretty strong guidance here. First, there's the simple observation. If the observed deviation rate, that's the percentage of failures in your sample, is high relative to how often the control is supposed to happen, you have a problem.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. If a control only operates once a month and you test it for 6 months and find one failure, that's a high deviation rate. One failure in a control that operates, say, less than daily is presumed to be a deficiency unless you do more testing.
Okay, let's get into the statistical insight the framework provides here, because this is where the jargon can really lose people. It talks about confidence levels and upper limit deviation rates.
Right. And it's so important. Let's try to translate that. This is where the accountants try to make the art of risk management into more of a science.
Good luck with that.
Well, you're conducting tests, right?
Yeah.
And the goal of your test isn't just to see how many failures you found in your little sample. It's to prove, with a certain level of confidence, that the underlying failure rate for the whole year's population of transactions is acceptably low.
So if I test a control 30 times and I find 0 errors, I might feel pretty good about that.
You might. But the statistics, the 90% confidence level the framework mentions, tells me that I still need to assume the underlying failure rate in the whole population might be as high as, say, 7 or 8%, just because my sample was small.
You have to account for the uncertainty.
Exactly. And the moment your statistical calculation says, based on this sample size and these results, we are not 90% confident that the underlying error rate is below 10%.
Which means more than 1 in 10 transactions might be wrong.
Right. The moment that happens, you haven't met the minimum bar. That failure immediately suggests a control deficiency, and it requires escalation.
That statistical rigor is crucial. What about the more qualitative factors that might suggest the test objective wasn't met?
We look for indications that the exception is systematic. For instance, if the exception only happened when processing non-standard or unusual transactions, that could indicate a potential design flaw in how the control handles complexity.
Or if all the errors were connected to a single high-risk area.
Yes, like transactions involving the calculation of goodwill impairment. That's a huge judgment area. Any failure there, that qualitative factor immediately elevates the risk.
And I guess the most undeniable indicator that a test objective was missed is when the exception has already caused real damage.
That's the smoking gun. If the exception is known to have resulted in a financial statement misstatement that exceeded the control's design level of precision. For example, if the control was supposed to catch anything over $50,000 and we find a $75,000 error that it missed.
Then the control has definitively failed its objective, no question.
No question.
And this brings us to boxes 2 and 3 in the chart. This is the iterative check, or what I'm calling the are we sure stage. If our initial test objective wasn't met, we don't just rush to judgment.
No, the professional standard demands this level of diligence. Box 2 asks, could additional testing support a conclusion that the observed deviation rate is not representative of the total population?
You're trying to rule out bad luck.
Or just simple sampling error. Maybe the one failure you found in your sample of 30 was truly an anomaly, and if you test 30 more, you'll find 0 more failures.
So management or the auditor can choose to do more work.
Correct. If they perform that additional testing, which is Box 3, and they reevaluate, they're trying to prove the control is effective overall. However,
There's always a however.
if they extend the sample and the deviation rate is still statistically unacceptable, the test objective is still not met. The finding is confirmed. It is now officially a control deficiency that has to be escalated to the next stage, which is Chart 2.
So Chart 1 really acts as a highly disciplined funnel. If the initial test is clean, or if the extended test proves the deviation was inconsequential, we stop.
We stop. No further consideration is needed for that specific test.
But if that deviation rate, especially when you project it statistically, remains too high, we now have a confirmed deficiency that requires grading.
Exactly. And that's where Chart 2 comes in.
Okay, Chart 2. You said this is the heart of the framework.
It really is. We've established that a control deficiency exists at the process or transaction level. This deficiency, it directly impacts a financial assertion like ensuring completeness or valuation. Now we have to assign its severity.
Deficiency, significant deficiency, or material weakness. D, SD, or MW.
Right. And this involves 2 major steps. First, determining if we've even crossed the threshold into a significant deficiency. And second, if we have, determining if we've crossed the next threshold into a material weakness.
Let's take step 1. It begins with Box 1, the initial magnitude check.
Yes, we ask, is the potential magnitude of the misstatement inconsequential? If the potential error is tiny, if it couldn't possibly move the needle for any reasonable user of the financial statements, it generally remains classified only as a deficiency.
And I'm guessing the framework provides a hard definition for inconsequential to limit the subjectivity. You can't just say, it feels small.
No, you can't. It suggests the threshold. For instance, it says potential misstatements that equal or exceed, say, 20% of the overall materiality threshold for the company are presumed to be more than inconsequential.
Okay, let's put numbers to that. If overall materiality for the company is $1 million,
then an exposure over $200,000 is too big to be dismissed as merely inconsequential. It's a real number.
Okay, that makes sense. So if we've confirmed the magnitude is more than inconsequential, we move on to the mitigation checks in boxes 2 and 3. This is where the debate over redundancy and compensation happens.
It is. Box 2 looks for redundant controls. These are parallel controls that achieve the exact same control objective.
So Control A fails, but Control B, which does the same thing, should have caught the problem anyway.
Exactly. If Control B was tested and found to be effective, it effectively mitigates the failure of Control A. The objective was still met, just by a different control.
Okay. And Box 3 looks for compensating controls. How are those different?
Compensating controls don't necessarily achieve the same objective, but they operate at a high enough level of precision to reduce the magnitude of the misstatement caused by the first deficiency down to an inconsequential level.
Can you give an example?
Sure. A very detailed, high-level management review of financial results at the end of the month might serve as a compensating control for a weak, low-level transaction authorization process during the month.
I can hear a skeptical listener thinking, well, why wouldn't every company just claim they have compensating controls for everything?
And they would be right to be skeptical. The framework itself injects some of that skepticism. It notes that truly effective compensating or redundant controls are pretty rare in practice.
Why is that?
Because the framework has this killer question. If the financial issue we identified, the misstatement, happened despite the presence of these supposed compensating controls, how effective can they truly be?
That's a great point. If they didn't catch it, they didn't work.
Right. If the backup parachute failed to open because the primary parachute tore its cord on the way out, you don't call the backup a successful mitigation if you're still falling.
That is a strong test. So if we pass through boxes 2 and 3 without finding any effective mitigation, meaning the deficiency is unmitigated and the magnitude is greater than inconsequential, where do we land?
You generally escalate to at least a significant deficiency.
Okay, that's step 1. Now for step 2, crossing that material weakness boundary.
Right. Box 4 is another magnitude check. If the potential magnitude is less than material to the financial statements, we usually conclude it's only a significant deficiency.
But if the potential magnitude is material, we enter the highest risk zone. So we again look for mitigation in box 5. Are there compensating controls that can reduce that magnitude to less than material?
This is really the last chance for mitigation to save you from an MW. If a $2 million material misstatement is possible because of a failure.
Which is above a hypothetical, say, $1 million materiality threshold.
Exactly. But a tested effective control reduces that exposure down to $400,000, which is less than the $1 million materiality threshold. That control helps downgrade the severity from a material weakness to a significant deficiency.
Okay, but what if the magnitude is material and there's no effective compensation?
Then you hit box 6, the critical likelihood check. We must determine if the likelihood of that material misstatement actually occurring is remote. This is the point where auditors, really earn their fee.
This sounds like the most subjective part of the whole process.
It demands extensive qualitative analysis. If the magnitude is material, you have to prove, based on qualitative factors, that the chance of it actually happening is remote. So we look at a series of risk factors.
Like what? What kind of factors are we talking about?
Well, things like the subjectivity and complexity of the amount involved.
Meaning it's not a simple cash transaction.
Right. Complex accounting estimates, like the valuation of specialized financial instruments or guessing the useful life of a major asset, they inherently carry more risk than a simple bank reconciliation. Increased complexity means an increased likelihood of an error slipping through a deficient control.
That makes sense.
What else? We also look at the susceptibility of the assets to fraud, the company's history of misstatements in that specific area, and the nature of the accounts themselves.
Certain accounts are just naturally riskier.
Definitely. Accounts like related party transactions, intercompany balances, or these catch-all suspense accounts are red flags. Their very nature makes them higher risk. A controlled deficiency affecting one of them elevates the likelihood of a material misstatement significantly.
So after all that, if you can definitively conclude the risk is remote, a slight chance, you might avoid the material weakness designation.
You might. But it is incredibly difficult to sustain that argument when the potential magnitude is already material.
Now for the final, crucial qualitative overlay, the prudent official test in boxes 7 and 8. Sounds fascinating.
It is. It ensures that the technical accounting assessment doesn't override common sense business judgment.
So what is it?
This concept, which has history in SEC guidance, asks us to step outside the technical auditing manual for a moment. We are asking, how would a responsible, highly diligent business person, a prudent official, view this deficiency?
So we're not asking what a CPA thinks. We're asking what a hypothetical, highly responsible, maybe slightly nervous business owner would think if they had this deficiency in their coffee shop. Is that the idea?
That is the perfect framing for it. It asks if the deficiency would prevent that prudent official from having reasonable assurance that their transactions are being recorded properly.
And if the answer is yes?
If the answer is yes, then the deficiency must be deemed at least a significant deficiency. That's box 7. It forces the classification upwards if the issue would just alarm a reasonable stakeholder.
And box 8 demands the ultimate version of that test.
Yes. Would that prudent official conclude that this is a material weakness? This qualitative assessment provides a really powerful backstop. It prevents a deficiency that technically falls just below a quantitative threshold from being dismissed if the underlying impact on trust and transparency is just catastrophic.
So you look at the system through the eyes of the end user, the investor.
Who depends entirely on the reliability of the output, yes.
Okay, one last thing on this chart. What about identified misstatements? If we actually find an error, that's not just a control test failure. That's definitive proof the system failed.
100% correct. A misstatement that is greater than de minimis, which just means a clearly non-trivial error, is ordinarily indicative of a control deficiency. You've proven the gap exists.
And if that known misstatement is already material,
then it's immediately considered at least a significant deficiency. You don't need to go through all of Chart 2 to tell you you have a problem if the material misstatement has already happened. The whole goal of ICFR is prevention. And if prevention failed on a material scale, the controls are weak by definition.
Okay. We've been focused very heavily on the transaction level, the controls that directly touch the dollars. Now we have to shift our focus to something more abstract, but potentially more dangerous. The realm of pervasive controls.
This is a crucial area. Because a failure here doesn't necessarily cause a direct error in a transaction today. It pretty much ensures that errors will happen tomorrow. It's systemic risk.
And the methods we used in Chart 2, which rely heavily on calculating dollar exposure, they're not really suited for this.
Not at all.
Let's start with Chart 3, which focuses on Information Technology General Controls, or ITGCs. What exactly is the architecture of an ITGC?
Okay, so ITGCs are the policies and procedures that ensure that computer systems themselves are secure, reliable, and operating as intended. They're the guardrails for the entire digital environment.
So not a specific calculation, but the system around the calculation.
Precisely. They are foundational because they support all the application controls, the automated calculations, the programmed edits, the system postings. If the ITGCs fail, all the automated application controls they support are presumed to be compromised.
So an ITGC is the control that mandates all system users have to change their passwords every 90 days, or that only authorized personnel can access the production server where the real data lives.
Exactly. And the framework focuses on 4 foundational areas for ICFR. First, program development, which is ensuring new systems are built correctly. Second, program changes, ensuring modifications are authorized and tested.
Okay.
Third, computer operations, which is making sure backups and processing schedules actually work. And fourth, access to programs and data, which is just what it sounds like. Who can touch the sensitive information?
The evaluation flow for ITGCs seems tricky because, as you mentioned, an ITGC deficiency doesn't directly result in a misstatement.
That's the fundamental distinction. It's an indirect risk. If the control over program changes fails, no dollar amount immediately changes in the financials.
The misstatement only happens later.
Right. It only happens if that failure allows an unauthorized, faulty application control change, like someone changing the VAT calculation rate in the ERP system, which then starts processing thousands of inaccurate transactions.
So you have to evaluate the ITGC deficiency based on its effect on the application controls it supports.
Yes. So if you find an ITGC failure, like a weak user access control, but you then test all the application controls supported by that system, and they're all operating perfectly, the ITGC failure might be classified as only a deficiency.
So it's a design weakness, but it hasn't actually manifested a material problem yet.
Not yet. However, if that ITGC deficiency did cause a material weakness in an application control, say, the lack of effective program change control allowed a programmer to accidentally change a depreciation calculation, leading to a material overstatement of assets.
Then the ITGC deficiency also becomes a material weakness.
It inherits the severity of the greatest risk it enabled. I like to think of it this way. If the ITGC is the gate, and the gate is broken, the gate's failure is as serious as the biggest threat that walked right through it.
What about a situation where the ITGC deficiency is just so widespread that it becomes a material weakness on its own without having to point to a specific faulty application control?
The framework acknowledges 2 paths for that. First, if the pervasiveness and significance of the ITGC failure are just so vast, let's say access controls are completely non-existent across the entire IT architecture that supports financial reporting.
A total breakdown.
Total breakdown. That leads to a conclusion of a material weakness in the company's entire control environment. It's a systemic failure of the foundational structure. The second path is management in action. If deficiency is classified as a significant deficiency and it remains uncorrected after a reasonable period of time, it often gets escalated.
Why is that?
Because that inaction signals a breakdown in the crucial monitoring component of ICFR, which forces the classification upwards. It says management doesn't take these risks seriously.
That brings us to Chart 4, pervasive controls other than ITGCs. This deals with the non-technical controls, the so-called soft controls that form the control environment, risk assessment, and so on, the COSO components.
And this is probably the most challenging area to evaluate, but let's first just clarify what these COSO components actually are, because they're often just listed as jargon.
Okay, let's unpack COSO. This framework is the structure, right? Like the house of internal control.
It is. So the control environment is the foundation of that house. The tone at the top, it reflects management's commitment to competence, integrity, ethical values. A weak control environment exists if management just demonstrates a disregard for compliance.
Okay, what about risk assessment?
That's how the company identifies, analyzes, and manages risks that are relevant to achieving its financial reporting objectives. If the company fails to recognize the risk of moving to a complex new revenue recognition standard, that's a risk assessment deficiency.
And monitoring.
That's the continuous checkup process. It's the internal audit function, the quarterly performance reviews, the whistleblower hotline. Monitoring ensures controls continue to operate effectively over time.
And finally, information and communication.
This just ensures that relevant information is communicated throughout the organization effectively and in a timely manner. If the accounting department finds a major error but doesn't tell the executive team promptly, that's a failure right there.
Since these controls don't touch dollars directly, quantitative methods really struggle. I mean, how do you quantify a deficiency in management's commitment to competence?
You really can't. The evaluation relies almost entirely on likelihood, pervasiveness, and qualitative factors. A deficiency here doesn't directly cause a misstatement. It just dramatically increases the likelihood that misstatements will occur at the process level or that existing misstatements won't get caught.
Okay, so let's use the risk criteria from before. If a deficiency in the control environment, say a known lack of resources in the financial reporting department, has a reasonably possible likelihood of contributing to a more than inconsequential misstatement, where does that land?
It lands as a significant deficiency. It's important enough for the board to know that their team is under-resourced to the point where they might miss non-trivial errors.
And if that same deficiency has a reasonably possible likelihood of contributing to a material misstatement,
then it must be classified as a material weakness. Imagine a control environment failure where management is known to be aggressive in their interpretations of accounting rules, combined with a monitoring failure where the internal audit function is routinely ignored.
that sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It is. The reasonable possibility that this environment will lead to a material, perhaps intentional misstatement is very high. The subjective failure has become a tangible financial threat, and that's why Chart 4 classification relies so heavily on qualitative judgment, particularly factors like susceptibility to fraud or management override.
It really highlights the difference between a failure in the engine, the transaction control, and a failure in the command structure, the pervasive control.
And the latter is much harder to fix and, frankly, potentially far more devastating.
Okay, we've spent a lot of time classifying individual deficiencies. But the complexity deepens when we realize that financial reporting systems don't fail in these neat, isolated silos. They fail collectively.
Which brings us to the necessity of aggregation.
We have to consider deficiencies in the aggregate. How should we be thinking about aggregating related failures?
The primary way to aggregate is by a significant account balance and disclosure. Let's go back to the complexity of the inventory account. Imagine you have 3 separate minor deficiencies. One is in the physical accounting process, another is in the cost capitalization process, and a third is in the obsolescence reserve calculation. Individually, each one might be classified as only a deficiency.
But when you combine them,
The cumulative risk to the accuracy of the overall inventory balance becomes exponentially greater. The failure in the obsolescence review might lead to a $100,000 misstatement. The failure in cost capitalization might lead to a $150,000 misstatement.
and together they create a $250,000 exposure.
Exactly. And that might cross the threshold into a significant deficiency or even a material weakness, depending on what the overall materiality for the company is.
This means the entire evaluation has to be reviewed holistically after all the individual classifications are made. You can't just stop.
Absolutely not. In the evaluation of the COSO components, the control environment, risk assessment, monitoring, that's even more challenging for aggregation. You might find several unrelated deficiencies in the control activities the manual processes, but when you look at them all together, they might point to a broader systemic weakness.
So unrelated control activity failures can actually aggregate into a broader COSO failure?
Yes, the source framework emphasizes this. It says, unrelated deficiencies in control activities can sometimes lead to a conclusion of a significant deficiency or material weakness in the broader COSO components.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. Let's say management is constantly issuing waivers for purchase authorizations. That's a transactional failure. And they also haven't updated their IT access policies in 5 years. That's an ITGC failure. And the internal audit team is understaffed. That's a monitoring failure.
They all seem like separate problems.
They do. But all those distinct failures, taken collectively, they suggest a serious breakdown in the overall risk assessment culture and the control environment itself.
The message is clear. The whole is greater than the sum of its inadequate parts.
That's a perfect way to put it. Now, let's tackle this statistical attempt to quantify all this risk. The framework provides an appendix, 10B, which outlines a potential approach for quantifying the magnitude of exposure to misstatement based on those observed deviation rates we talked about earlier.
Okay, this is where the art of risk management tries desperately to become a science.
It really is.
We need to explain this slowly and clearly. This approach tries to use statistical sampling results, the failure rate in our small sample, to project the potential monetary loss in the entire population of transactions.
And the core calculation uses this concept of adjusted exposure. It's defined as the gross exposure multiplied by the upper limit deviation rate.
Okay, let's define the inputs. What is gross exposure?
Gross exposure is the worst-case scenario dollar amount. It's the total dollar volume processed by the control or the total balance of the account affected during the relevant period.
So, if the control we're testing is the process for reviewing, say, $10 million in weekly invoices,
Then the gross exposure for the year is $520 million. It's the total amount of money that could be misstated if the control failed every single time. It's the whole pot.
okay, the whole pot. Now for the upper limit deviation rate. This is the most technical part.
This rate is absolutely essential for statistical conservatism. As we discussed back in Chart 1, when we test a small sample, we can't just assume the failure rate we observed is the true failure rate of the whole population. We're not that lucky.
Right.
So we have to use a statistical table, usually at a 90% or 95% confidence level, to calculate the highest possible failure rate that could exist in the total population, while still being confident that the true rate is not worse than that limit.
So we're being forced to assume the statistical worst case because we only looked at a tiny portion of the transactions.
Precisely. If we find one error in a sample of 30, we can't just say the risk is 3.3%. The math forces us to assume the risk is likely much higher in the remaining, 97% of the population we didn't look at.
Let's walk through the example from the source material to make this concrete and memorable.
Good idea. Imagine we are testing a manual control, say, the daily review of supplier credits. We test a sample of 30 operations, and we found one exception, one failure. We had planned for 0 deviations.
So our observed failure rate is 1 in 30, or 3.3%.
Correct. But now we go to the statistical table at the required 90% confidence level, and the calculation shows that for one failure in a sample of 30, the upper limit deviation rate is 12.4%.
Wow, that's a huge jump from 3% to over 12%.
It is. We're now 90% confident that the true failure rate in the general population of all supplier credits for the year is no worse than 12.4%.
And that 12.4% becomes our risk multiplier.
That's our risk multiplier. Now, let's apply the gross exposure. Assume the total dollars processed by that supplier credit control during the year was $4 million.
Okay, so the calculation is $4 million, the gross exposure, multiplied by 12.4%, the upper limit deviation rate.
And the result is an adjusted exposure of $496,000.
Almost $500,000.
Almost $500,000. And that is the calculated monetary exposure to misstatement caused by that single statistically projected control deficiency.
And this $496,000 is the figure we then use for comparison against our overall financial statement materiality.
Exactly. If our materiality threshold for the company was, say, $500,000, this single control deficiency, despite only having one error in our sample, has now crossed the line. It's likely a material weakness based on magnitude alone.
And if the materiality was, say, $1.5 million.
Then the $496,000 exposure places it firmly in the significant deficiency category. This process provides that necessary objective link between a statistical test failure and a real financial consequence.
However, the framework issues a pretty powerful warning about this quantification procedure. We can't just treat this number as gospel.
No, absolutely not. The framework stresses that this adjusted exposure is an approximation procedure, and it is not a substitute for directly testing the account balance itself.
Why not?
Because the relationship between a control failure and a monetary error is often imperfect. An error in a $5 invoice is treated the same as an error in a $5 million invoice in the control test itself.
But they have wildly different monetary impact.
Wildly different. Plus, we're often using relatively small sample sizes in these tests, which makes the statistical projection, that upper limit deviation rate, highly sensitive to small changes. Finding one error versus 2 can have a massive impact on the final number.
So it's a powerful diagnostic tool to quantify the potential risk.
But it has to be used alongside all the qualitative judgment, understanding the root cause, and considering any mitigating factors. It's one data point in a very complex decision, not the final verdict.
We have successfully navigated one of the densest professional frameworks in financial reporting. I mean, we went from a simple test exception in Chart 1 all the way through the methodical process of judging severity in Chart 2, and then into the murky waters of systemic risk in Charts 3 and 4.
And we saw how crucial both of those things are. the statistical rigor, quantifying exposure via upper limit deviation rates, and that subjective human judgment, anchored by things like the prudent official test, are to defining financial integrity.
The overarching lesson seems to be that the journey from a minor failure to a catastrophic material weakness is, or at least should be, systematic and structured.
It requires diligence, not just calculation, and a constant awareness that real mitigation is rare and often unreliable.
And that leads us back to that final, most complex challenge we talked about: aggregation. The framework suggests that control issues in one CSO principle can reflect on another, requiring this really careful aggregation.
Yeah, and if you look at those pervasive controls we discussed, the control environment, monitoring, risk assessment, and you find these seemingly unrelated minor deficiencies just accumulating across different departments.
Like a small IT access failure in the manufacturing plant.
And a slight lack of management review in the month-end closing process.
And a few transaction errors in the overseas subsidiary.
Could those small, individually non-material failures, through aggregation, could they coalesce to create a situation where the entire system becomes unreliable?
That's the ultimate question, isn't it? How quickly could those minor, disparate failures undermine the integrity of the entire financial reporting system and create a material weakness in the fundamental control environment itself?
And that really is the ultimate measure of a system's resilience. It's not just about the effectiveness of the individual checks and balances. It's about the unbreakable strength of the overall architecture when it's faced with the inevitable reality of human and system error.
That's definitely something to mull over the next time you look at a compliance report. Is your system designed for individual efficiency, or is it designed for collective resilience? Wait, let's unpack this. We are diving deep into a topic that, on the surface, can sound intimidatingly dry: internal control over financial reporting, or ICFR.
Right.
But in reality, it's the hidden scaffolding. It's what supports, trillions of dollars of investor trust. This isn't just about spreadsheets and compliance checklists.
No, not at all. It's really the integrity of the data that drives the whole global economy.
Exactly. It's the trust foundation.
It absolutely is. And for you, the learner, whether you're navigating corporate governance or maybe you're studying regulatory environments, our mission today is pretty ambitious.
It is.
We want to cut through that compliance fog. We're going to try and understand the extreme precision that's required here. We're looking not just at what companies have to disclose, but why it matters, and the often frustrating complexity behind delivering that very specific, very unforgiving kind of financial assurance.
We're talking about the rule setters. I mean, the SEC, the PCAOB, COSO, these are the big authoritative bodies dictating how entities, especially the public ones, have to prove year after year that their financial machinery is actually effective.
Effective enough to prevent material errors from ever slipping through the cracks and ending up in their public filings.
And we have some great source material that really highlights the critical divergence points in this world.
We do.
Yeah.
We're going to spend some serious time dissecting the difference between mandatory reporting for public companies and, on the other hand, the real pitfalls of voluntary reporting for private ones.
Then we'll get into the core of the challenge.
Right, the highly technical and sometimes, frankly, harsh rules around what management has to assert, especially when they have to disclose control failures, which everyone knows as material weaknesses.
And we're going to wrap all this up by tying in the integrated role of the independent auditor and maybe the most complex practical challenge for any CFO. The precise timing and judgment needed to fix these problems, that whole process of remediation.
It's a total tightrope walk. A few days, literally, can mean the difference between a clean audit opinion and a very public disclosure of failure.
So let's jump right in. Let's start with that fundamental schism, the great divide between public and non-public companies when it comes to reporting on ICFR.
Do it.
Okay, so the starting line is really the regulatory mandate. If you're a public company, you have one set of rules. If you're private, the rules are, let's say, a lot more flexible.
Unless someone demands otherwise. That's the key. Right. That's the crux of it. For public entities, the mandate is crystal clear. They must publicly report on the effectiveness of their ICFR and, critically, disclose any material weaknesses they find.
And that, of course, all comes straight out of Sarbanes-Oxley.
It's a direct legacy of SOX, specifically Section 404. It's enforced by the SEC, monitored by the PCAOB. It's completely non-negotiable. It's this required, continuous public disclosure meant to maintain investor trust.
But the world of non-public entities, I mean, this is a huge category. It covers everything from massive private corporations to universities to not-for-profits.
It's a vast world.
And it's fundamentally different. Generally, they are not required to report on ICFR effectiveness. There's just an absence of a mandate.
But that absence, that vacuum, it often gets filled by outside pressure. We see two main forces that kind of pull non-public entities into a reporting requirement anyway.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is specific regulatory requirements that are very targeted. So, for example, you have some non-filer banks that are mandated under FDIA, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation Improvement Act, to report on controls.
But not their full ICFR, right?
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
It's often specific controls over compliance with certain laws and regulations that are relevant to their banking sector.
So a bank might have to prove it has controls around, say, anti-money laundering compliance, if that's what the regulator is focused on. It's a targeted thing.
Exactly. It's a very sharp, very specific focus.
Yeah.
And the second source of pressure, which is arguably even broader, comes from stakeholders.
You mean lenders,
Yeah.
investors?
Right. Think about venture capitalists pouring hundreds of millions into a startup, or a big institutional lender providing a crucial line of credit. They will often write covenants into their agreements that require an ICFR report.
Why? What's the driver for them?
Well, they're acting as absentee owners or risk managers. They need that assurance for their own capital decisions. They want to know the books are solid before they put their money on the line.
And our sources also point to the GAO, the Government Accountability Office. It seems like they're looking in this direction, too.
They are. The GAO, which, monitors government agencies and anyone receiving federal funds, has signaled that it may start requiring some form of internal control reporting for entities under its audit jurisdiction in the future.
That's a big potential expansion.
It is, and it's key. It suggests that regulators, who are facing more and more demands for fiscal responsibility, are seeing ICFR reporting as a really valuable tool for accountability, whether the entity is public or private.
Okay, so let's take an example. Let's say a big private university wants to raise a huge bond issue, and the lenders demand an ICFR opinion. How do they actually do that? I mean, they don't fall under the PCAOB rules for public companies.
They turn to the AICPA standards, specifically something called the Statement on Standards for Attestation Engagements, or SSAE, or 15.
SSAE 15, okay.
And what's crucial to understand here is that SSAE 15 was intentionally designed to converge the reporting standards for these non-public entities with the really rigorous rules public companies follow.
So PCAOB auditing standard number 5.
Exactly, AS number 5.
So they're essentially taking the Cadillac standard of ICFR auditing AS number 5 and just applying it under a private auditing framework. Is the level of rigor actually the same as what a Fortune 500 company faces?
The process and the criteria for assessing effectiveness, yes, they are designed to be largely identical. The SSAE 15 report covers both the design of the controls, are they structured correctly on paper, and their operating effectiveness.
So do they actually work in practice?
Right. Do the controls function reliably, day in and day out? It's a full spectrum check.
I see. So what if a private entity is worried about the cost of all that operational testing? Is there a shortcut for them?
There is a narrower alternative. If an entity only wants to report on just the design of the control system.
So they want to say, look, on paper, the system could work.
Precisely. They want assurance that the system, if it were implemented perfectly, could catch errors, but they don't want to pay an auditor to test if it's actually working. In that case, they'd use the guidance in AT Section 101.
And that lets them avoid all that costly, time-intensive testing of operations.
Exactly.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. Why would a non-public entity voluntarily put itself through the full, rigorous SSAE 15 process, knowing the massive cost and the resources involved? Is it just about impressing a bank?
It's often about something a little more abstract. It's about perceived trust, about market profile, especially in the not-for-profit sector, the NFP world. NFPs exist in this highly competitive environment, right? They're all competing for limited donor funds. And our source material points out that after some of those unfortunate stories about misuse of funds at really well-known charities.
You mentioned United Way, the Red Cross. Those were big headlines.
They were. And donor confidence can be really, really shaken by that kind of news.
So the NFP uses the ICFR attestation as a kind of preemptive strike against reputational risk. They're signaling stability, transparency.
Precisely. They're making a proactive, very costly statement to potential contributors that basically says, look, our financial machinery is subject to the same rigorous independent audit standards as a publicly traded company.
And even though the ICFR report is about financial reporting reliability, not every single spending decision.
Right, but the willingness to submit to that intense scrutiny, that builds immense contributor confidence.
It's a fascinating psychological effect. I mean, if you're a donor comparing two similar charities and one volunteers for this level of financial inspection, the other one's silence suddenly becomes kind of conspicuous.
Yeah. That's what the source material argues. It's the natural evolution of governance. As more governmental and high-profile non-public entities start requiring this kind of attestation, the absence of it for other entities might eventually be seen as a real negative signal.
That makes perfect sense. But let's look at the flip side here, the reality of these voluntary projects. Our sources really emphasize the pitfalls. If it's voluntary, it's vulnerable.
That's the key challenge. Voluntary projects get suspended all the time. The initial enthusiasm, it's driven by a new CFO or a board mandate to professionalize, but it just evaporates when management gets the bill.
It's not just the external audit cost, is it?
Oh, not at all. It's the massive internal cost. Documenting every single process, assessing risks, identifying every control point, it's a huge lift.
So what's the typical project killer?
It's the sheer magnitude of control deficiencies they find in the early stages. The project kicks off, the internal team starts documenting, and suddenly they're finding severe problems they had no idea existed.
And because they don't have that public company mandate for immediate disclosure,
they have a way out. The most common tactic is just indefinite suspension. They stall the assessment project until all those deficiencies they found are remediated.
It's a luxury that public companies just do not have.
Not at all. A public company finds a material weakness in Q1, they're scrambling to fix it before year-end, or they disclose the failure. A private entity just puts the binder on a shelf.
Right. It's the difference between mandatory disclosure and discretionary timing.
Exactly. And to give you a sense of the scale, think about a large, complex, non-public entity, like a major academic research hospital or a big state university system.
They're sprawling.
They are. They have all these semi-autonomous units, the fundraising arm, the research labs, the clinical practice, the athletic department.
They're like decentralized mini companies all under one umbrella.
That's a perfect way to put it. And many of these units operate with a ton of autonomy and often lack any dedicated controls procedures or monitoring resources. So trying to map, document, and test the ICFR across all those different units.
It's a colossal project.
It is. Underestimating the resources needed in these environments is the rule, not the exception. And that inevitably leads to what you could call the complexity crush and project suspension.
So if the project gets suspended, the auditor has already found these deficiencies. What happens to those findings? Do they just get buried?
No, the findings don't just vanish, but they do stay internal. The governance of the non-public entity, the board, the audit committee, they still get communications from their auditor about control deficiencies found during the regular financial statement audit.
So they know there are problems in the control environment.
Oh, they know. The communications will specifically highlight significant deficiencies and material weaknesses. But these are strictly for internal consumption, for governance oversight. They're not typically shared publicly unless, a regulator or a lender has a contractual right to see them.
So it underscores that even without the public mandate, the internal function of governance still demands transparency about control failures.
It does. The board is still on the hook.
Okay, let's shift gears now to the high-stakes world of public company ICFR reporting. This is where precision is absolutely paramount, and it all starts with management. They can't just pass the buck to the auditor.
That's right. The core responsibility for establishing and maintaining ICFR lies entirely with management. And ICFR itself is defined as a process designed to provide reasonable assurance.
And reasonable assurance, we should say, is not absolute assurance.
No, it's a key distinction. It implies there's a cost-benefit consideration, but the system still has to be fundamentally sound.
And the regulations break down ICFR into 3 very specific goals. Why is it so important to detail these goals instead of just saying something vague like financial integrity?
Because these goals define the actionable perimeter of what a control failure actually is. They articulate precisely what the controls must do.
Okay, what's goal 1?
Goal 1 is record integrity. The system has to maintain records that accurately and fairly reflect asset transactions and dispositions. This is the foundation. If you can't trust the numbers in the ledger, you can't trust anything that comes out of it.
Makes sense. Goal 2.
Authorization and preparation. The system must provide reasonable assurance that transactions are recorded correctly to prepare financial statements under GAAP, and that all receipts and expenditures follow management or director authorizations.
So it prevents rogue spending or misclassifying things.
Exactly. And then goal 3 is asset protection. This is the protection layer. The system has to provide reasonable assurance about preventing or detecting on a timely basis any unauthorized acquisition, use, or disposition of assets that could materially affect the financial statements.
So this is the defense against fraud, internal or external.
The defense against fraud that could actually hit the financials, yes.
So those 3 goals define what a successful ICFR system looks like. And based on how management evaluates those areas, they have to reach a binary conclusion.
It is absolutely binary. If management determines that no material weaknesses exist as of their year-end balance sheet date, then they can conclude that their ICFR is effective. It's a clean opinion.
But the hammer falls immediately if any significant problems are found.
The hammer is swift, and it is total. If just one material weakness exists at year-end, management is instantly precluded from stating that their internal control is effective. The SEC guidance is crystal clear on this.
One single material weakness means the entire ICFR system failed at that moment in time.
It means it failed to provide reasonable assurance, yes.
And that one rule, the need for 0 material weaknesses, is probably the single biggest driver of compliance cost in the world.
I think you're right. It dictates the intensity of the testing, the urgency of remediation, because anything less than perfection at year-end means a public admission of a control failure.
And this leads us right into the extreme rigor of the management report itself. The SEC has guidelines for the content, right?
Oh, very strict guidelines. Releases 33.8238 and 34.47986. They're designed to ensure comparability. This is not the place for companies to get creative with their language.
Adventurous experimentation is discouraged. I like that phrasing from our source.
It's perfect. The mandatory conclusion must state plainly whether internal control is functioning effectively. And the SEC has explicitly banned 3 specific types of reporting.
And these are critical for anyone learning this to understand.
They are. First, negative assurance is banned. Management cannot say, well, nothing has come to our attention that would suggest ICFR was not effective. That's not good enough.
You have to make an affirmative statement. It is or it is not.
Exactly. Second, qualified conclusions are banned. You can't say, our ICFR is effective except for this one little material weakness over here.
Yeah.
No. If the weakness exists, the conclusion is ineffective. Full stop.
You can't qualify the effectiveness.
You can't. And third, scope restriction is banned. Management can't say, well, we couldn't assess 5% of our operation, so our report only covers the 95% we could get to. You have to assess the material portion of the entire system.
That third point, scope restriction, brings us to a very common and very technical headache: the service organization problem.
This is a huge issue in the modern economy. Almost every large company relies on third parties for critical processes.
Things like cloud computing, payroll.
Right. Complex treasury functions, mortgage servicing. The list is endless. And management still has to assert control effectiveness over the transactions processed by these outside service organizations.
And they usually do that by relying on a SOC1 Type 2 report from the service organization's own auditor.
That's the standard mechanism. But what if that service organization is uncooperative? What if they fail to produce the SOC report? Or they deny your auditor access for a review?
Management can't just shrug and exclude that function from their assessment.
No, they have to determine if this inability to assess is significant enough to conclude that their overall ICFR is not effective. If a material chunk of your transaction processing is a black box, you've lost reasonable assurance.
And the outcome is often a conclusion of ineffective because of a scope limitation they didn't even directly create.
It happens. And the SEC's guidance here is very practical. It ties governance directly to contract law. They strongly recommend that companies include a mandatory right to audit clause in their contracts with these outside service providers.
It's just pure risk mitigation.
It is. It gives the company the contractual teeth they need to get the assurance, protecting them from an ineffective conclusion caused by a third party.
Now, in very rare cases, scope limitations might be unavoidable. Our source material had that extreme example of a facility closed due to civil unrest, locked and patrolled by armed guards.
It sounds like something out of a movie, doesn't
Yeah.
it? But yes, if you physically cannot enter a material facility to perform your assessment because of legitimate physical or political barriers, management has a huge dilemma.
They can't just not file their report.
No, the sanctions and fines for that are severe. The process in that highly unusual situation is you must consult the SEC staff in advance. You have to explain the situation and work with them to agree on the least bad outcome. It might involve a highly detailed explanation of the circumstance, maybe some temporary relief, but it requires upfront approval.
The standard expectation is still no scope restrictions.
Absolutely.
Let's touch on the COSO framework briefly. Management has to state what criteria they used. And since late 2014, they've been expected to say whether they used the original 1992 framework or the updated 2013 framework.
Right. The 2013 framework was a big update. It made the internal control structure more principle-based, more adaptable to modern IT systems and global operations. The SEC chief accountant at the time, Paul Beswick, he made it clear.
He didn't ban the 92 version,
But he basically said the expectation was a swift transition. He warned that the SEC might start questioning reports that continued to use the older framework. After enough time, he suggested 18 months, had passed to implement the new one. It was a very strong nudge.
So let's ground this in a real example. We looked at an American Express report. What are the mandatory compliance markers that jump out?
First, the explicit assertion of responsibility. Management says, we are responsible for establishing and maintaining adequate ICFR. They own it.
Okay.
Second, they state the criteria they used. Criteria set forth by the COSO Internal Control Integrated Framework. They name the benchmark. And third, the unqualified conclusion. Our assessment leads us to conclude that ICFR is effective as of date. It's clean and direct.
And what about the necessary disclaimer, that inherent limitations paragraph?
That's a legal necessity. It's the paragraph that notes that due to inherent limitations, things like human error, collusion, management, override ICFR, might not prevent or detect all misstatements. It clarifies that ICFR provides reasonable assurance, never absolute certainty.
It manages investor expectations without undermining the conclusion.
Exactly. And it says that projecting effectiveness into the future is risky because conditions can change. It's a required piece of boilerplate, but it's important.
So when the system fails to get that clean conclusion, it's because management has found deficiencies. Before we go further, we need to really solidify the technical definitions here, the scale of the problem. What's the difference between a significant deficiency and the much more serious material weakness?
Okay, let's use an analogy. Think of a bridge being built. A significant deficiency, or SD, is a design flaw, or maybe a bunch of flaws, that could result in a misstatement of the financial statements that is more than inconsequential.
So it's not trivial.
Right. It's serious enough that it needs the attention of the people responsible for oversight, like the audit committee. It's a serious crack in a support beam of the bridge.
A risk, but maybe not an imminent structural collapse.
Exactly. Now, a material weakness, an MW, that is the catastrophic fault line. That is a significant deficiency or an aggregation of them that's so severe it precludes the entity's internal control from providing reasonable assurance that material misstatements will be prevented or detected on time.
So if that control fails, a material error will probably hit the financial statements without anyone inside catching it.
That's the risk. The system has failed in a material way.
And once that MW is confirmed, the conclusion is immediate. ICFR is not effective as of year-end. But the disclosure obligation, that's where the SEC has really been focusing its attention lately. They want more than just the existence of a problem.
They do. The goal is to provide investors with real analysis, with substantial detail. This is laid out in SEC Release 338810. Management has to go beyond just saying, we had a weakness in revenue recognition. They need to explain why it exists, what impact it had, and crucially, whether it's a continuation of an old issue or a brand new problem.
And vague disclosures just trigger more questions from the SEC.
Right. It creates unnecessary back and forth with the SEC staff who are just trying to fill in the blanks.
And this vagueness, it creates huge downstream problems. Our source material calls it the research remediation problem.
This is a perfect example of a policy having unintended consequences for research. Imagine a company reports an MW in their IT access controls this year. And 2 years ago, they reported an MW related to their general IT environment.
How does an academic researcher or even a sophisticated investor know if the first one was actually fixed and this is a new problem, or if the company just renamed the same old lingering failure?
They can't. They have no way of knowing, especially since, as we'll see, auditor opinions on remediation are incredibly rare.
So researchers might make faulty assumptions about how quickly companies are actually fixing these things.
Exactly. And if their studies on the effectiveness of SOX or the speed of corporate remediation are flawed, then the conclusions are flawed. And those flawed conclusions can harm the policymakers and users who rely on that research to see if the rules are actually working. The lack of detail breaks the feedback loop.
That brings us to maybe the most crucial high-stakes concept in this entire deep dive, the as-of reporting date. Why does the fact that the ICFR assessment is a snapshot in time, not a continuous assessment, make such a profound difference?
It creates the window of opportunity. The SEC requires management to report effectiveness as a specific point in time, say December 31st, not throughout the whole year. And that temporal distinction means that finding a deficiency early is, in a strange way, a gift.
A gift because you have time to correct it.
Exactly. If a material weakness is identified in Q1, management can take immediate, aggressive corrective action. They can redesign the control, implement it, and then test the new remediated control. And if that new control is found to be operating effectively for a sufficient period of time before year-end...
And on December 31st, they can still conclude that their controls are effective.
That's right. They disclose the issue and the fix in their interim 10Q filings, but their final annual 10K can still carry that effective ICFR opinion.
And this ability to remediate during the year is just fundamental to the whole system's health.
It is. If companies had to report ineffective for the whole year just because a control failed in January, the rate of ineffective opinions would be much, much higher. It would create a lot of market instability.
Plus, when remediation is successful, the auditor can rely on those fixed controls for part of the year, which leads to those audit efficiencies we talked about.
It does. But the judgment call on whether a fix is truly a fix, whether it has been operated for a sufficient period of time, that is incredibly difficult. This is a huge professional judgment call for both management and the auditor.
Let's break down the 3 factors that govern this judgment, because this is where the complexity really explodes.
This is where we move from black and white rules into professional analysis.
Okay, factor 1, the nature of the control objective. This is about the scale and reach of the control.
Right. We distinguish between narrow, transaction-oriented controls, like a specific control over how you value inventory, or a daily review of vendor invoices. These have a very direct effect on the financials.
And because they're narrow.
Improvements are detected really quickly. If you change a form to require one more signature, you can confirm people are doing it within days or weeks. So they require a shorter operating period after the fix to prove they're working.
But the other side of that coin is much more abstract, much broader.
That's the control environment-oriented controls. These are the big, foundational, squishy controls. Things like management's tone at the top, the company's ethics training program, the general hiring and retention practices.
And when you try to remediate a weakness in, say, the tone at the top, you're trying to change corporate culture.
You are. And you can't fix corporate culture in a week. It's incredibly difficult to confirm that a press release or a new training module has genuinely filtered down and resulted in sustainable improvement.
So corrections to these environment-oriented controls need to be in place for how long?
A much longer period of time. You might need 6 months, maybe even a year, to gather enough evidence through internal surveys, consistent behavior, or reduction in other related deficiencies to reliably conclude that the tone has actually improved and is affecting how other controls perform.
Okay. Factor 2, the nature of the correction. This is the difference between human and machine performance.
Right. This is all about consistency. If the correction is automated or system-based, let's say you patch a flaw in an IT system that was miscalculating accrued interest, that correction, assuming you have good IT general controls, will perform consistently from the moment you deploy it.
The application doesn't get tired or forget its training.
Exactly. So you only need a relatively short period of time to confirm the fix works. But if the remediation relies on human performance...
Like a new procedure requiring managers to review exception reports.
Yes. Say 50 regional managers now have to review these reports and document their investigation. Human performance varies. People forget, they get busy, they interpret the instructions differently. So that correction has to be operating effectively for a relatively longer period before you can reliably conclude that the new behavior is consistent and sustained.
And finally, factor 3, frequency of the corrected control procedure. This is just about how often the control fires.
This is purely about gathering evidence. If a control is frequent, like an automated credit check, for thousands of online sales every day, you can gather a huge sample size in a matter of days. You can get sufficient evidence of remediation very quickly.
But if the procedure is infrequent.
If a control only happens once a month, like an account reconciliation, you absolutely need to wait longer. If you find a deficiency in your monthly reconciliation, you'll probably need to observe and test it for more than one monthly cycle, maybe 2 or 3, to gather enough evidence to overcome the prior failure and prove it's fixed for good.
So just changing the procedure document, waiting a month and assuming it's fixed is totally insufficient.
Completely. The new functional controls have to be retested, and that new evidence must be enough to satisfy both management and the auditor that the risk is truly gone.
It's all interconnected.
It is.
This high-stakes remediation process flows directly into the work of the independent auditor. This is the integrated audit. And this is where the audit of controls and the audit of the financial statements become two sides of the same coin.
Right. The integrated audit is designed to be an efficiency mechanism when it works well. The premise is really simple. If a company's controls are effective throughout the year, the auditor gains confidence in the consistency of the underlying data.
So if the controls are strong, the audit is faster and presumably cheaper.
That's the economic benefit. That confidence allows them to significantly reduce the extent of other very costly substantive tests on the books and records.
Well, what if the controls were broken for most of the year and only fixed right at the end?
Then the company loses that benefit. If controls are only effective at the reporting date, the auditor can't rely on them to reduce substantive testing for the period they were ineffective. They still have to do a ton of testing for those first 3 quarters.
So the total cost of the audit goes up.
Significantly. The company loses those efficiencies.
Now, when auditors issue their reports for public companies, for accelerated filers, they have a choice. They can issue a separate report on the financials and a separate report on ICFR, or a combined report. What's the common practice here?
Oh, the separate reporting option is overwhelmingly favored. While combining them is technically possible, the presentation can get really complex and cumbersome to read. Separation just maintains clarity for the users.
And speaking of dates, let's nail down this report dating requirement. This is what exposes companies to what our source calls post-balance sheet risk.
Right. The auditor has to date their audit opinion on ICFR as of the same date as their financial statement audit report. And that date is critical because it can't be issued until all the evidence for both reports has been obtained.
Which means the auditor's work spans that gap period between the year-end as-of date and the final report issuance date.
A period of several weeks or even a couple of months.
So the post-balance sheet risk is that the auditor has to keep asking for updated information on controls during that gap period. What happens if a brand new, previously unknown material weakness pops up then?
It creates a crisis. Because the reporting date, the as-of date, December 31st, has already passed, that new material weakness cannot be remediated in time for the current annual filing.
So it forces the auditor to conclude that ICFR was ineffective as of the reporting date, even if management didn't know about it on December 31st.
Exactly. It's a powerful incentive for management to keep their control monitoring going, even after the year is officially closed.
Let's talk about the required communication, this two-way street that binds management and the auditor. What does management have to tell the auditors and the audit committee?
Management is required, under the Exchange Act, to disclose all material weaknesses and significant deficiencies in control design or operation that could adversely affect the company. The key word is timely.
If they hide a deficiency until the last minute,
It creates a huge problem. The auditor won't have time to properly assess it, and that could cause a major delay in filing, which can trigger sanctions.
and this verbal communication is backed up by a very formal legal letter, right? The management's required written representations.
Yes, required by AS number 5. This is where management formally takes ownership of the entire process. The representations are exhaustive, they're non-negotiable.
But what's on that list?
Well, management has to confirm their responsibility for ICFR. They have to state their final assessment conclusion effective or ineffective. Then there's a really critical point. They have to confirm they did not use the auditor's procedures as the basis for their own assessment.
That maintains the independence of management's own judgment.
It's crucial. Then they have to disclose all identified deficiencies, specifically listing out all the SDs and MWs. They have to describe any fraud involving senior management. And finally, they have to confirm whether prior period deficiencies have been resolved.
That is a comprehensive accountability structure. Now, what about the other way? What must the auditor communicate back to management and the audit committee?
The auditor's responsibility is just as precise. They must communicate in writing all material weaknesses they found to management and the audit committee before they issue their ICFR report. And they must communicate in writing all significant deficiencies to the audit committee.
And what about the smaller stuff, the minor cracks in the pavement that aren't quite significant deficiencies?
The auditors should communicate those lesser deficiencies in writing to management, and they have to tell the audit committee that they made that communication. It ensures the audit committee knows a full sweep has been done and that management is now responsible for tracking those smaller fixes internally.
So the key to success here really sounds like continuous coordination between the auditor and management all year long.
It's essential, especially during the drafting of the final reports. Management needs to review their draft report against a rigorous auditor checklist to make sure it's complete, they're using the right definitions, and crucially, that they're correctly disclosing existing MWs without accidentally disclosing MWs that were successfully fixed during the year.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, and often where companies run into unexpected trouble. We have to emphasize this fundamental truth. Every single auditor adjustment or correction to company-prepared financials is evidence of a control deficiency of some magnitude.
That is the critical link that people forget. If the auditor finds a calculation error in inventory that management missed, that's not just an accounting correction, it's a control failure.
A failure in the internal controls over inventory valuation.
Exactly. And if you see consistent large audit adjustments year after year, that is a flashing red light indicating a systemic control problem that could easily escalate to a significant deficiency or even a material weakness.
So the effort management puts into careful preparation, into documenting their estimates and assumptions robustly. That's not just good bookkeeping. It's an effective and efficient control activity in itself.
It absolutely is. It reduces the likelihood of severe findings and ultimately saves money. And finally, we should mention the role of legal counsel. The SEC counsel should be intricately involved in drafting and reviewing these reports.
Why is legal counsel so critical for what seems like an accounting document?
Because it's not just an accounting document. It's a regulatory disclosure that carries significant legal weight. Counsel ensures the report meets all SEC requirements, especially around liability. They help management navigate that fine line of disclosure without exposing the entity or the signing officers to unnecessary legal risk.
Now, companies sometimes include optional statements in their annual reports, maybe in the MD&A section, about future control changes or remediation plans. What's the auditor's responsibility for that extra commentary?
The auditor has to review it. Generally, they will disclaim an opinion on that additional information because it's outside the scope of their audit opinion. However,
There's a but.
there is. If that optional information contains a material misstatement of fact, for example, if management falsely claims an MW was fixed when it wasn't, the auditor can't just ignore it. They have to discuss it with management, and if it's not corrected, they must notify the audit committee in writing.
So the auditor is a comprehensive backstop. Their own report has to be modified if management's report is incomplete, if there's a scope restriction, or if the CEO and CFO's personal Section 302 certification is misstated.
That's right. They are the final line of defense for the integrity of the report.
And this brings us full circle, back to material weaknesses. When an MW is publicly disclosed in the annual 10K, there is a very clear expectation from the market and regulators.
The expectation is timely correction, ideally within the next fiscal year.
And if they don't meet that deadline, the consequences are quarterly and they're cumulative.
Absolutely. An unremediated issue has to be explicitly reflected in the required quarterly Section 302 certifications. Management is personally certifying that controls are ineffective quarter after quarter. And these deficiencies usually require specific disclosure in the 10Q reports as well.
And a lingering, unremediated issue year after year must raise serious questions.
It does. It raises questions for investors and regulators about the competence of governance, or maybe the fundamental robustness of the entire control environment.
Okay, let's talk about the very specific and, as it turns out, rare circumstance of an auditor actually attesting to a remediation. Companies can talk about their fixes, but they can't bring the auditor into that assertion very easily.
That's correct. Management can make all the disclosures they want about their remediation efforts, but the auditor cannot be associated with those assertions unless they follow the very specific procedures laid out in PCAOA Auditing Standard Number 4.
AS number 4. Reporting on whether a previously reported material weakness continues to exist.
That's the one.
And AS number 4 is optional, right? Companies are not required to hire an auditor for this service.
It is entirely optional. And since that standard was issued, reports confirming remediation under AS number 4 have been extremely rare.
Why? What's the barrier?
Primarily cost. Engaging the auditor to perform a full AS number 4 process just to confirm a remediation assertion before the next annual report is a significant expense. And most boards choose to just defer that confirmation until the next mandatory integrated audit.
So the market has to wait nearly a full year to get a clean, verifiable update from an independent source that the MW is actually gone.
That is the reality. If a company wants that interim auditor confirmation, they have to proactively engage their auditor, consult with them, and review the rigorous requirements of AS number 4 in advance. They can't just ask for a quick confirmation letter. They have to commit to the full standardized process.
A process that's apparently too expensive for most to bother with.
In practice, that seems to be the case. Tag out TRO.
So, after all that, what does this all mean? We've cut through a lot of that ICFR fog, and we've seen that this reporting process is, well, it's a masterclass in precision and legal sensitivity.
It really is.
We've established that a single material weakness can instantly invalidate an effective conclusion, forcing a company to admit a control failure to the entire world.
And we've learned that the timeline for getting back to good isn't arbitrary. The complexity of the remediation, especially for controls based on subjective human performance or the broad control environment, can dictate a very long and difficult timeline for management.
And the integrated audit is the economic consequence. If your controls fail, your financial statement audit work goes up, and your audit efficiencies get wiped out.
The SEC's demand is for transparency and real analysis, not just labels. They want investors to understand the true nature of the control failure, which, as we saw, is crucial for good policy research and accurate market assessment.
And that tension, that constant tension between the as-of date that required snapshot and the messy year-long remediation process, that's really the ultimate balancing act for management.
It is. And you, the listener, now understand the incredibly high stakes and the uncompromising precision required in these reports. And given how rare an auditor's report on remediation really is because of the cost, and given how hard it is for anyone on the outside to tell if a material weakness is new or just a relabeled old one, this raises an important question to mull over.
In a world where financial data flows continuously in real time and companies are valued based on instantaneous information, how much confidence should sophisticated users truly place in a single, fixed, as-of snapshot of control effectiveness?
Especially when the financial barrier to getting independent verification of a successful fix encourages companies to delay that verifiable update for a full year.
It forces the market to trust management's word. And that waiting period, that really defines the limits of regulatory assurance today.
It highlights the unavoidable trade-off. The trade-off between the precision that compliance demands and the timely, continuous assurance that the market desires. And that trade-off, more often than not, is settled by the price tag. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, our mission is, it's really laser-focused. We're putting together the ultimate efficiency toolkit for you for managing your entire internal controls assessment process.
Yeah, we're talking about everything. SOX compliance, the COSO framework, the works.
Exactly. And we've got a great set of sources here that leverage really a full decade of experience since those frantic early days of implementation.
Right. This isn't just about surviving the annual cycle anymore.
No. This is about being strategic. It's about maximizing effectiveness, cutting down on wasted effort, and really making sure that every hour your team spends is delivering real, measurable value.
That's absolutely right. I mean, for most organizations, this whole assessment process has matured. It's become a predictable, recurring annual event.
And that's where the danger lies, isn't it?
It is. Anything that becomes routine carries this hidden, insidious risk, the risk of complacency. We have the benefit now of historical data, going back to the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in 2004 and the AICPA standards in 2007.
So there's a lot of maturity in the system.
A ton of procedural maturity, but that maturity, paradoxically, can sometimes breed sloppiness or what we call check-the-box fatigue.
I love that framing. The risk of complacency that's inherent in maturity. The source material talks about this phenomenon, the Sagora story, kind of morphing over time.
Exactly.
Think about this for your own organization. You are likely on the second, third, or maybe even the fourth generation of project team members who are running this assessment.
Which means fewer and fewer people are actually reading the original regulatory requirements or the fundamental COSO documents themselves.
They're just relying on inherited knowledge.
Or worse, yeah. They're just inferring what the requirement is from last year's documentation, which might have already been a weak interpretation.
It's like corporate compliance via the telephone game.
It is. You start with this pristine, well-defined control objective, and by the time it passes through 3 different teams over, say, 8 years, the interpretation might be completely insufficient.
Or the documentation is just a template that's being filled out without any real critical thought.
Precisely. And over time, the process just loses the high priority it once commanded. Budgets get constrained, resources dwindle, and the whole effort becomes purely transactional.
Just going through the motions.
That's it, exactly.
And the data we have seems to support this idea that we're only achieving, well, partial success here.
It does. I mean, while greater diligence since the early 2000s has certainly lessened the losses from public company frauds and, mitigated that trend of increasing financial state restatements.
These still happen.
They still happen, and with alarming regularity. If the process were fully successful, those numbers would be near zero.
Right.
The fact that they aren't is a clear signal that the quality and performance of these internal efforts, it tends to deteriorate over time. And without some kind of periodic strategic intervention, that deterioration is just the general rule.
So what does this all mean for you right now? The 2013 COSO framework revision, it isn't just another regulatory update to file away.
No, it should be seen as a critical stimulus. It's the required intervention to stop that quality slide, to refocus your effort, reassess your efficiency, and make sure that the enormous recurring cost of compliance is actually delivering the intended risk mitigation.
This is your opportunity, really, to strategically overhaul the process based on a decade of hard-won experience.
Exactly. We need to treat this revision as a catalyst for a strategic overhaul. It's time to move past that initial scramble and get into a phase where precision, authority, and efficiency are paramount.
And if we can nail the structural foundation of the assessment,
then all the work that comes after becomes exponentially easier.
Yeah.
And that brings us, immediately to the first step in maximizing that efficiency, structuring the project team correctly and defining their authority from day one.
Okay, so let's start with the core mandate. We're jumping right into COSO Principle 3 here, which focuses on establishing appropriate reporting lines, authorities, and responsibilities within the entity's control environment. But our sources suggest applying that exact same principle internally to the assessment project team itself. Why is that so critical, applying it to this temporary project structure?
Because the whole assessment is driven by an existential mandate. And that mandate has very personal stakes attached to it.
You mean for the executive signing off?
For the executives, exactly. The penalties for CEOs and CFOs who sign false Section 302 and Section 404 certifications have absolutely not diminished. The personal stakes, including, potential criminal penalties, remain extremely high.
So the team doing the work has to reflect that level of seriousness.
They have to. The internal assessment team must possess the necessary seniority and authority to reflect that severity and importance across the entire organization.
So given those high stakes,
Yeah.
what is the non-negotiable reporting line for this internal control evaluation team?
Well, the team must report directly to a senior committee. Ideally, that's the disclosure committee, or even better, directly to the CEO and CFO themselves.
The certifying executives.
The ones signing their names on the dotted line. This achieves something vital that a mid-level reporting line simply cannot.
Which is what?
It immediately establishes two critical facts for everyone in the company. One, that the successful completion and the truthfulness of this evaluation is a mission-critical, high-priority objective for the entire entity.
And two.
And two, that all communications and requests from the project team command timely cooperation and high priority across all departments, no exceptions.
That's a really practical insight into organizational dynamics.
Yeah.
I mean, if the control assessor is, say, a senior manager reporting to the controller, they might spend 3 weeks chasing a critical piece of evidence from the VP of operations.
Right, they'll get the runaround.
But if that same assessor reports directly into the disclosure committee, the VP of operations knows they need to comply, and they need to comply immediately. Authority just streamlines communication.
Absolutely. The lack of that senior authority causes two immediate risks. First is delay, which obviously compromises your project timeline.
And the second is resistance.
Resistance, exactly, which forces you to compromise on the quality or the completeness of the assessment. Both of those risks lead to a compromised result and a deeply inefficient process.
So beyond that seniority and authority, let's detail the composition essentials for this project team. What skills and knowledge need to be collectively present in that room?
Collectively, the group has to represent the operational, the technical, and the analytical knowledge of the entire business. They must have a high-level knowledge of the entity's core operations, its strategies, and critically, the authority to get and allocate the necessary resources.
And we can break the team down into 3 essential groups, right?
That's right. You need your key operating personnel, you need your technical IT specialists, and you need the testing and evaluation teams. You need the operational depth to define the risk, the technical capability to manage the systems that process the data, and then the audit execution capacity to verify the controls are actually working.
Okay, so let's drill down into a resource that already exists in almost every publicly traded company. The internal audit, or IA, function. They seem uniquely positioned to maximize efficiency here.
Well, they are. Internal auditors are a natural fit for this work, and including them offers 2 primary contributions that directly reduce the overall cost of compliance.
What's the first one?
First is the use of their work product. Their routine responsibilities, their normal audit schedule, if it's properly aligned, already generates documentation on control design and evidence that supports operational effectiveness.
So you're not reinventing the wheel.
You're not. And over time, sophisticated IA work programs can be intentionally aligned so they accomplish their own internal risk-focused mission while simultaneously collecting documentation that's relevant to the SOX process. It becomes part of their regular job, not some add-on task.
Which means that documentation is already produced, it's already been reviewed, and it's just ready to be leveraged. That's a huge efficiency gain right there.
It's massive. And the second contribution is using them as a project team member or supervisor.
Because their skills overlap so much.
Exactly. The tasks inherent to IA risk assessment, control verification, process mapping, they overlap so significantly with SOX objectives that they're just a natural fit as project members or even as the day-to-day leaders.
And they already know the company.
Right. Given their intrinsic knowledge of company processes, of the risk profiles, of the historical issues, they can often be trained and ready to go far faster than external hires or other personnel who would need this intensive, costly orientation.
What specific subject matter expertise do IAs bring to the table that really enhances the overall project quality?
Well, a few things. They enhance the team's understanding of significant risks and the existing controls. They are the internal experts on who you need to cooperate with, and they provide insight on the relative historical strengths and weaknesses of the different internal control components.
And they often bring the IT piece.
Crucially, yes. They often bring technical expertise in internal IT auditing, a domain that, as we'll discuss, is absolutely non-negotiable today, and they can directly assist in documenting control design and actually executing the tests.
I know one of the reasons IAs became even more valuable, starting around 2007, was the introduction of Auditing Standard Number 5, or AS Number 5, from the PCAOB.
Right.
And that standard replaced the much more restrictive AS Number 2, and it offered independent auditors more flexibility in relying on the client's internal work, especially IA's work.
You've just hit on a critical pivot point for efficiency. AS number 5 is indeed considerably more flexible. It allows much more reliance on the work product of internal auditors provided.
There's always a provided.
Always. Provided the IAs are rigorously assessed as being objective, tested, and competent.
And that's a key insight for you listening. If your management can align the IA functions with SOX requirements and clearly document IA's competence and objectivity,
Meaning they maintain their own internal quality control standards.
then the independent auditor can significantly reduce their own scope of testing. And that directly and measurably minimizes your audit costs.
That's the goal. So it isn't just for the IA to do the work. The goal is for the IA to do the work in a way that the external auditor is mandated to trust.
So what specific evidence does that IA team need to assemble to support their objectivity and competence? It's got to be more than just completing a checklist.
Oh, much more. It goes way beyond the checklist. To prove competence, the IA department has to demonstrate structured, recurring training programs in both auditing methodology and the latest accounting standards.
And their work has to be reviewed.
Their work products have to be subjected to high-quality internal review, maybe a peer review or supervisory review to show that they're adhering to internal standards.
And objectivity.
For objectivity, their reporting line is key. They must report functionally to the audit committee or the board to ensure their independence from management. If these standards are documented and presented proactively, the external auditor can perform a high-level review of the IA function and then rely on that internal work product for large swaths of the testing rather than doing redundant testing themselves.
And that is where the cost savings truly materialize.
That's the prize.
Okay, so that flexibility is fantastic for IA. But it immediately raises a massive caution flag when we talk about using other internal personnel, specifically operational and accounting staff, in the assessment project.
Yes.
These individuals are essential because they provide that crucial, in-depth understanding of business segments, risks, and controls. But their involvement runs straight into what you call the objectivity challenge.
That is the major caveat, and it's a very common trap. When you ask the manager responsible for the accounts payable department to assess the controls within accounts payable, their self-assessment of those controls is acceptable for the company's internal SOX tasks and for the management assertion. However, the independent auditors will view assessing one's own department with profound skepticism.
It's the classic ethical scenario. Grading your own exams. Even if you're completely honest, the perception of a lack of objectivity makes the result unreliable to any external, independent third party.
And that skepticism is well-founded. I mean, research consistently shows that managers frequently overlook deficiencies in their own internal procedures.
Or they downplay them.
Or, when they do find them, they often underrate their severity because they feel pressure to produce a clean assessment. This is exactly why the PCAOB mandate in AS number 5 is abundantly clear.
What does it say?
It says the independent auditor must assess the competence and objectivity of all persons whose internal work they plan to use to determine the extent of their reliance.
Let's nail down those two terms as AS number 5 defines them. We talked about how they apply to the IA function, but how do they apply to, say, the general accounting staff?
Okay, so competence means attaining and maintaining a level of understanding and knowledge that enables that person to perform the tasks assigned to them ably.
So for a staff accountant testing controls, this means they have the training to understand things like sampling methodology and control objectives.
Exactly. And then objectivity means the ability to perform those tasks impartially and with intellectual honesty. The auditor has to evaluate whether factors are present that inhibit or promote that impartiality.
Like whether their annual bonus is tied directly to a favorable assessment of their own department's controls.
That's a perfect example.
And there's an absolute non-negotiable rule here that the project team leader needs to memorize if they want to maximize reliance and avoid having the external auditors just toss out weeks of their team's work.
Yes, this is the absolute rule. The auditor should never use the work of persons who have a low degree of objectivity, regardless of their level of competence.
Okay.
And likewise, they should not use the work of persons who have a low level of competence, regardless of their objectivity. It's a dual constraint. You need both.
Let's give a concrete example of that absolute rule in action. Say we have the most brilliant financial analyst in the world, extremely competent, working on controls in their own department.
Okay.
They find an issue, but because they report to the VP, whose compensation is tied directly to a clean assessment of that area, meaning they have low objectivity, that work is essentially unusable by the external auditor.
That's right. The auditor would have to reperform everything from scratch.
And that's where the costs pile up.
Precisely. Competence is easy to prove, with certifications and training records. Objectivity is harder because it involves looking at organizational structure and incentives.
So people like internal auditors are expected to have greater objectivity because of their reporting structure.
Correct. So the proactive takeaway for companies aiming for efficiency is this. If you want to maximize reliance and minimize audit costs, you must assemble the relevant information supporting the objectivity and competence of all internal project participants in advance of the audit.
You have to make the auditor's reliance decision easy, not difficult.
Exactly. Efficiency is achieved by proactively clearing those reliance hurdles for the external auditor.
Okay, let's move on to the third core component of the team, technical specialists. Most modern entities are complex, they're heavily reliant on automated systems, and financial reporting itself has become increasingly judgmental.
Right.
Where is specialty assistance most frequently required today that maybe wasn't as prevalent 20 years ago?
Well, technical expertise is essential in any complex, judgmental, or technical area that requires advanced, non-traditional accounting knowledge. But today, the specialist need is absolutely critical in fair valuation.
Why there specifically?
Given the increase in monetary assets and liabilities that are accounted for at fair value, especially those classified as Level 2 or Level 3 inputs under the accounting standards, you need specialists. They are required to evaluate the appraisal processes, the impairment tests, and the controls surrounding the integrity of those valuation models.
And that's far outside the typical domain of a general staff accountant.
Far outside. Because fair valuation often involves models, assumptions, and judgments that are highly subjective. For instance, Testing controls over a level 3 fair value asset might involve verifying the assumptions used in a discounted cash flow model.
Which requires economic or quantitative expertise.
It does. The control activity isn't just checking a journal entry, it's validating the entire judgment process. You need a specialist who understands what a reasonable assumption looks like in that specific market.
And then there's that area that auditors have historically described as vexing, a term that always indicates chronic difficulty.
Yes, that would be the tax accrual process. Controls over complex tax accruals, especially related to uncertain tax positions, have historically been a significant struggle for many entities, and they've often led to material weaknesses.
Now, pre-SOX, this was more collaborative, right?
It was. Specialty assistance in this area was often provided in collaboration with the independent auditor's own tax specialists. But due to the tightened independence rules for public companies, that collaborative approach is no longer allowed.
Because it creates an inherent conflict. The auditor can't design the client's tax process and then audit the financial statements that rely on it.
Exactly. It's auditing their own work. So the entity must now secure that specialty assistance, perhaps a dedicated tax controls expert, either internally or through an independent consultant. The compliance landscape shifted that risk and responsibility fully onto management.
And finally, the necessity that underlies nearly everything we do today, IT specialists. You simply cannot assess controls without them anymore.
It's non-negotiable. IT expertise is required for almost all complex systems and networks. Indicators that you need a high degree of IT expertise include things like significant e-commerce activity, extensive data sharing between different applications, or using emerging technologies like cloud computing or SaaS solutions.
So if financial data touches a computer, you need IT specialization on the team.
That's the bottom line.
What are the key tasks for these IT specialists? The scope must extend beyond just simple application controls.
Oh, much further. They are essential for identifying IT-related risks and then for documenting and testing two key types of controls. First, you have the application controls, which are the controls built into the transaction processing software.
Like an automated three-way match in the purchasing system?
Perfect example. But second, and equally vital, are the IT general controls, or ITGCs. This is specifically what COSO Principle 11 addresses.
Okay, let's pause there because we need to clarify that critical COSO principle for our listeners. COSO Principle 11 gets mentioned a lot, but what does it actually mandate?
Well, COSO Principle 11 states that the entity selects and develops general controls over technology to support the achievement of objectives. In practice, ITGCs are the foundation. They govern the entire IT environment.
So things like access security.
Access security, who can log in and what they can do. Program change management, making sure changes are authorized and tested. Systems development, data center operations, all of it.
And if those ITGCs are weak?
If the ITGCs are weak, for instance, if any employee can upload code changes without any oversight, then all the application controls that are built on top of that foundation are unreliable, regardless of how well designed they might appear to be.
So the IT specialist's primary task is ensuring that foundation is rock solid.
Yes. And if controls are found to be deficient or missing, they're the ones needed to design and implement the remediation and then monitor the continued effectiveness of those controls.
And this requires a proactive strategic approach. Our source material emphasizes this, referencing guidance from places like ITGI and ISACA.
It does, specifically the IT control objectives for Sarbanes-Oxley. The guidance notes that success requires not just systems changes, but a fundamental change in culture.
What does that cultural change look like in practice, particularly for the Chief Information Officer, the CIO?
The cultural shift is moving IT from being a cost center that's just focused on uptime to being a strategic partner that's responsible for the data integrity that supports financial reporting.
So management has to understand the risks, and the CIO has to understand the controls.
Exactly. Management and the project leader must get a clear understanding of the risks inherent in their specific IT systems. Broad generalizations are totally ineffective. And the CIO needs advanced knowledge of the specific IT controls required to support reliable financial information processing.
And that often requires significant enhancements.
It often does in the design, the documentation, and the evaluation of those IT controls. If the CIO doesn't understand that system integrity equals financial reporting integrity, the resulting controls will inevitably be inadequate.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, the integrity of the financial statements really begins with the integrity of the data processing environment.
It does.
The IT specialist is literally the guardian of the input and processing stage.
That's a great way to put it. You cannot have a high-quality assessment without treating the CIO and the IT specialists as core members of the controls team with the same authority and resources as the senior finance personnel.
That sets the stage perfectly for Section 2, where we talk about optimizing the actual teams doing the day-to-day work, the testing and evaluation teams.
Right.
Now, depending on the size and complexity of the entity, the core project team might do the testing themselves, or they might delegate that task to separate evaluation teams.
And if you delegate the testing, you immediately introduce the need for extensive standardized training to ensure you get consistency and quality across potentially dozens of different team members working in different places.
But the most efficient practice that has emerged over the last decade is actually the integration of these functions.
Yes, it is.
So let's unpack this integration. Having the control documentation and the control testing performed by the same team members.
Yeah.
Why is that model so successful from an efficiency standpoint?
The rationale is pure economic efficiency. The documentation teams have already spent significant time becoming intimately familiar with the controls, the process flows, the underlying systems.
They're already up to speed.
They are ready to go. Once they complete the documentation and assess that the control design is sufficient, they're perfectly positioned for testing. Training this existing documentation team in basic testing methodologies like performing walkthroughs or sampling is generally far more efficient than training a whole dedicated testing team on the intricate details of controls they have no hand in documenting.
And the source notes that this efficiency is even further enhanced when the project is logically organized.
Yes, absolutely. When projects are oriented around logical transaction cycles, think procure to pay or order to cash, rather than being compartmentalized strictly by general ledger accounts, the efficiency of this integrated approach improves even more. The documentation just naturally flows into the testing phase within a well-defined boundary.
You mentioned that this separation of design from testing is a bit of a historical artifact.
It is. The separation grew out of the initial confusion of the early SOX requirements, which discussed the design phase and the testing phase separately. Plus, many early implementers tried to get help from their independent auditors for testing.
Which was limited by the independence rules.
Severely limited. It often confined the external auditors to the role of being mere scribes in the documentation process. The integrated approach we see today is really the benefit of a decade of practical experience, recognizing that the continuity of knowledge is a huge time saver.
But wait, let's be the critical voice here for a second. Isn't that a false economy? You save a week or two of training time, but you sacrifice the quality check that comes from having a second set of eyes.
That's a fair point.
I mean, what if the cost of missing one material weakness far outweighs that little efficiency gain?
And that is the acknowledged primary quality risk. When the same person documents a control and then tests its effectiveness, they might subconsciously overlook or minimize or just fail to thoroughly test an issue they themselves created or relied upon in their documentation.
So you are absolutely sacrificing the benefit of independent verification.
You are. You lose the benefit that comes from a dedicated quality control team.
So how do we close that gap? How do we get the economic advantage of integration while mitigating that quality risk?
By enforcing a much higher level of rigor in one specific area: supervision. Effective and close supervision of each phase of the assessment process becomes absolutely essential. The supervisor has to take on the role of that second set of eyes. They need to perform detailed reviews of the documentation before testing begins, and then critically review the testing work papers for thoroughness, correct sampling application, and accurate conclusion formulation.
And this requires the supervisor to have significant experience and, crucially, the time necessary to actually review the work, not just sign off on it.
That's the key. So the efficiency gains are real, but they mandate a compensatory higher level of supervisory rigor that management must commit resources to. The efficiency is basically transferred from the testing phase to the review phase.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are undertaking a fascinating mission. We're exploring the often invisible but incredibly crucial infrastructure that really holds modern corporate finance together.
It really is the bedrock.
It is. I mean, if you've ever looked at a Fortune 500 financial statement and wondered, how can they possibly be sure those billions are accurate? Well, today we're diving into the answer.
We are.
We're pulling back the curtain on the world of internal controls documentation. This is what ensures accuracy, compliance, and maybe most importantly, the prevention of fraud.
That's exactly right. We're getting into the highly practical, tactical documentation methods that auditors and compliance teams use day in and day out when they're assessing internal controls over financial reporting, or ICFR.
And we're looking at this specifically through the lens of COSO.
Yes. The Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission, the integrated framework. And while COSO has been around for decades, our focus is really on that critical 2013 update.
Why that one specifically?
Because it forced professionals to completely rethink how they document, how they analyze, and ultimately how they justify their conclusions about financial controls. It was a sea change.
So our source material for this dive, it really details a professional struggle, doesn't it? This necessary, and I imagine sometimes painful, shift that accounting professionals had to make after Sarbanes-Oxley, or SOX.
Oh, absolutely painful. We're talking about moving away from these sprawling, just unwieldy documentation methods that, almost felt designed to intimidate auditors.
You just bury them in paper.
Yeah, exactly. And moving towards streamlined, principle-focused forms and, leveraging some pretty serious database technology.
So our mission today is to show you not just what controls are necessary, but really how the professionals translate those abstract rules into robust, defensible documentation.
And there's a core tension we're going to explore. The design goal for efficient data entry for the person filling out the forms. It often clashes, directly, with the need for easy data analysis for the person reviewing it.
Okay, input versus output.
Precisely. And we'll show you how the COSO 2013 framework tried to solve that very tension by essentially separating the collection format from the analysis format.
And speaking of tension, we are going to share a startling true story a little later on.
It's a chilling one.
It really is. It's an anecdote that demonstrates exactly what happens when documentation relies on, simplistic, check-the-box mentalities, a huge failure that led directly to a company's bankruptcy.
It's a story that highlights why getting the design of these assessment forms right is, it's a matter of solvency, not just compliance.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. If we strip away all the complexity, what is the foundational purpose of all this documentation? What is the auditor actually trying to align here?
The primary goal is holistic alignment. It's about creating a visible chain of custody for accountability.
A chain of custody, I like that.
Yeah, the documentation has to rigorously align the control objectives or attributes, that's, what the control is supposed to achieve, with the actual control procedures being performed. And then it has to link those procedures to the relevant financial statement assertions and, critically, tie it all back to the initial assessed risks.
So if any link in that chain is missing, or even just a little vague,
then the documentation is functionally useless. It's just noise.
And for, a decade after SOX came into force, the professionals who had to deal with this, they lived and breathed the matrix format.
Yeah.
That was the standard, right?
It was the absolute standard operating procedure. It was the initial default because, it offered a way to map multiple variables across a single line item.
Right.
The use of these matrices, which were prominent in the 1992 COSO framework and then later in the AICPA audit guides, they just became the immediate go-to.
And what did that look like in the 92 framework?
It was pretty simple, actually. They used an OFC for operating, financial, or compliance to identify the nature of the control objective.
So is this control for efficiency, for reporting, or for following the law?
Basically, yes. It was a very broad scope.
But for an auditor who's worried about accurate financial statements, the financial component has to be the most important part, correct?
Absolutely, and that's what drives the evolution of the documentation itself. Over time, that simple OFC focus, it transformed into something much more precise.
Okay, so how did it evolve?
By the time the 2006 COSO guidance came out, the documentation box had shifted its focus almost exclusively to recording the relevant financial reporting assertions.
Let's pause there because that's a critical term. For our listener, what exactly is a financial statement assertion?
Right. Think of assertions as the specific claims that management is making about the numbers in their financial statements.
Claims. Okay.
So when management presents, say, the accounts receivable balance, they are asserting several things. They're asserting existence, that those customers actually exist and owe the money.
Sure, makes sense.
They're asserting completeness, that all the money they're owed has actually been recorded. And they're asserting valuation and allocation, that the amount is correct and any, necessary bad debt allowance is properly estimated.
So an auditor isn't just checking if the numbers add up. They're checking if the claim behind the number is true.
Exactly. And the matrix was structured to assess how the control procedures address those specific claims and objectives. This really confirms that increased emphasis on the financial implications.
So the shift from OFC to specific assertions like existence and completeness, that was a huge step up in rigor.
It was. It underscored that internal controls were evolving from, like you said earlier, a simple checklist mentality into a really rigorous qualitative assessment focused squarely on financial risk.
Okay, so if the matrix was so structured and it served this purpose for years, why did it ultimately fail? What made it so unwieldy that they needed a complete overhaul?
Well, the matrix approach, it really just broke down because of the rising complexity of modern business, global business,
Yep.
the need for a level of detail that spreadsheets just couldn't handle visually.
It just got too big.
Way too big. When you try to document all the necessary layers of modern controls, not just the control, but who does it, when they do it, the results of sampling, the assessment of outsourced activities in a fixed longitudinal matrix format, it rapidly becomes functionally impossible.
Our sources mentioned that some of these SOX spreadsheets would have double-letter column headings like AA, AB.
That's the symptom, exactly. Imagine a massive Excel sheet. To accommodate every single piece of required documentation, you had to keep adding columns. And yes, our sources say they'd often extend well past column Z into those double-letter headings.
You're creating a horizontal document that just scrolls forever.
You are. You're creating a document that is designed to ensure you miss something.
What about the text? The descriptions?
That was the other huge problem. If you needed to input a narrative, say, describing your sampling method or an exception you found, that text might be way longer than the cell.
So you have two bad options.
Yeah. Two bad options. You either let the cell expand and wrap the text, which dramatically distorts the entire row and ruins the visual advantage of the matrix, or you keep the cells a fixed size, which limits what you can display and you lose the information. Either way, the very advantage of the matrix format was lost. It just became impossible to quickly scan, review, and integrate the information.
So the complexity of modern business globalization, outsourcing detailed sampling, it ultimately broke the spreadsheet. The documents needed their own zip code.
They really did.
So what was the solution proposed by the 2013 guidance? How did they solve this core conflict between efficient data entry and easy analysis?
The 2013 revision proposed a fundamental strategic separation. It said you must divorce the format you use for data collection from the format you use for data analysis.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice?
The solution was using structured forms for efficient data entry. So instead of entering data into this sprawling multi-column matrix that tries to do everything at once, the data is collected via a specific ordered form designed for completeness.
And then that collected data goes where?
It's instantly leveraged by using a database as the central data repository.
So the form is the input device and the database is the brain. That makes perfect sense. You use the form to make sure you get everything, and then you use database tools to make sense of it later.
Exactly. The preparer just follows the form, making sure they capture all the required details: control ID, assertion, risk, procedure. Then, once that data is in the database, the reviewer or the senior staff,
They can slice and dice it however they want.
They can generate reports that easily sort and present all the deficiencies and findings in any perspective necessary.
But didn't that create a new challenge? How do you guarantee all these separate forms ultimately talk to each other?
That's the power of the database. It allows the data to be easily sorted and presented in different ways that are crucial for review. You can generate reports sorting deficiencies by assertion, by account, by COSO principle, or by component.
Which facilitates a much better review?
A much better review and integration of findings. And that's absolutely vital when the team needs to reach that aggregate conclusion about overall control effectiveness.
And finally, you have to ensure all the data flows logically. The work papers can't be a mess.
No, the flow of documentation is paramount. Disorganized work papers, they just contribute to mistakes and make an accurate review nearly impossible. The revised framework really emphasizes how deficiencies identified at, say, the transaction level or the entity level must properly roll up.
So they all end up in one place.
Eventually, yes. They have to be summarized in a single document, classified by both component and principal, for that final, crucial aggregate evaluation. This structured, methodical flow prevents issues from getting lost or misclassified.
I think it's important to note 16 of the 17 COSO principles require some kind of documentation, but one area is special, right?
Right. The control activities area, the one dealing with the day-to-day transactions, that often requires many individual forms because of the sheer volume and granularity of the controls that have to be documented separately.
And that brings us directly into the two main documentation types. Let's tackle the high-level one first, the principle-based forms, like Appendix 13A in our source materials.
Right. These forms are designed for the big picture. Their job is to assess the design and effectiveness of evidence for the overarching principles. There are 17 total, but like we said, these forms usually cover 16 of them.
And you separate out that complex control activities component.
Exactly. We leave that for its own transaction-based documentation. So the goal of the principle-based form is really to document the evidence that supports the effective functioning of a specific COSO principle at the entity level.
Okay, let's use a concrete example. How would a professional document the effectiveness of, say, Principle 4, commitment to attract, develop, and retain competent individuals?
Perfect example. This shows how the form guides the auditor's thinking. The form starts by explicitly outlining the points of focus for that principle, the specific actions management has to take to meet the requirement.
So what would those be for Principle 4?
For Principle 4, those points might include things like establishing formal competence policies, continuously evaluating personnel for deficiencies, and having a documented succession plan for key roles.
And the form tells the preparer to look for that evidence.
It directs them. It tells them to list and reference associated work papers. So links to HR policies, evidence of training programs, or minutes from meetings where management reviewed talent gaps.
I can see how that immediately helps a junior staffer. It's like it tells them exactly what evidence to look for, so they're not just aimlessly searching through company files.
It forces them to think like a senior auditor by guiding them directly toward risk and related principles. It's a huge shift.
And crucially, the form has a section for risks, right?
Yes, a section to document any inherent or fraud risks that were identified elsewhere in the audit plan, maybe during the risk assessment component, that are relevant to this specific principle.
Why is it so vital to renote those risks on a principal form, especially if they were already identified somewhere else?
It's an essential check against tunnel vision. Experience just shows that staff working on one area, like reviewing HR competence, they're not always aware of the planning issues or the high fraud risks identified by other teams or senior management.
So it's a mandatory reminder.
It is. By forcing the preparer to confirm the specific fraud risks relevant to that principle, the documentation acts as a mandatory reminder to be vigilant and to tailor their testing. If the risk is high-level fraud, the auditor has to assess if a lack of competent staff makes that fraud more likely to happen.
And these principle-based forms, they also require documenting interdependencies, correct?
Yes. They prompt the preparer to document not only the deficiency found in Principle 4, but also any related principles that might be consequentially affected.
Give me an example of that.
Okay, so a systemic deficiency in Principle 4, a lack of competent staff, that will almost certainly lead to an issue in Principle 5, which is holding individuals accountable for internal control deficiencies.
Of course, if you don't have competent people, you can't realistically hold them accountable for failures.
Precisely. And documenting that interaction early allows the assessment team to allocate resources or conduct additional testing in those related control areas before it becomes a bigger problem.
So that covers the entity level, big picture controls. But when we get down to the operational level, the transactions that actually create the financial statements, that's where we shift to the hyper-detailed transaction-based forms.
Right, like Appendix 13B, which deals with control activities. These forms are the real workhorses of the documentation process.
And they're for Principle 12.
They are. They're vital for addressing the many specific controls that fall under Principle 12, deploys through policies and procedures. This is where you get the most granular, covering all the core transaction cycles, revenue, cash receipts, inventory, payroll, period-end adjustments, all of it.
Why do these transactions need such granular separate forms? Why can't they just be aggregated into, say, one big form for the whole revenue cycle?
Because the complexity of the assertions is just too high to aggregate. Let's stick with that revenue recognition example. Controls over revenue recognition have to be addressed separately by account or transaction cycle because the risks are fundamentally different.
Okay.
Consider the assertion of completeness, making sure everything that was earned got recorded. A control for that might be tracking shipping documents against invoicing documents.
Right.
Now, consider the assertion of valuation, making sure the revenue is recognized at the correct amount. A control for valuation might be a review of the gross to net calculation for sales discounts.
I see. A deficiency in the completeness control would mean you're understating revenue, but a deficiency in the valuation control could mean you're misstating revenue at the wrong price.
Entirely separate risks.
and requiring entirely separate control procedures.
Exactly. Aggregating those different control sets under a single amorphous principle form would just risk massive confusion, incompleteness, and a failure to map the control to the actual financial risk it's supposed to mitigate.
So the transaction form makes sure every specific control, like requiring dual authorization for a credit memo, is mapped directly to the financial statement assertion it addresses.
Yes, to things like occurrence or accuracy. And the form itself goes into incredible detail, identifying whether the control is preventative or detective, automated or manual.
It forces that classification.
It does. Is the control preventive, meaning it stops an error before it happens, like restricting access to a pricing file? Or is it detective, catching an error after it happens, like a reconciliation review? And it also identifies the associated tech, like the customer verification process or the automated three-way match in ERP System X. That level of detail is non-negotiable now.
Now, connecting back to that interdependence theme, you mentioned IT general controls, ITGCs are the foundation. Why do deficiencies here have a pervasive effect? And why are they often the first thing you look at?
ITGCs are the bedrock because, well, technology underpins virtually every single transaction cycle today. If the ITGCs are weak, the integrity of every automated transaction, from revenue calculation to inventory tracking, is immediately suspect.
And that's what pervasive effect means.
It is. It means that a failure in this one single area, the IT foundation, could potentially affect all account balances and transactions that rely on that system, across all locations and all cycles.
For our listener, though, why should a poor password policy in the IT department impact how I view the revenue recognition control? They seem pretty unrelated.
They are deeply related because of that pervasive effect. If the ITGCs are flawed, if, say, there's poor security or no change management, then the effectiveness of any automated control, even a really well-designed one.
Like a system that automatically calculates revenue.
Right, that system is immediately compromised. How can you trust the automated revenue calculation if you can't trust that an unauthorized programmer hasn't modified the underlying code to skew the numbers?
I see.
Auditors have to prioritize this area because fixing ITGC deficiencies can save vast amounts of time that would otherwise be spent manually testing hundreds of automated controls that are assumed to be flawed because of that pervasive system weakness.
It's like testing the foundation of a skyscraper.
Exactly. If the foundation fails, you don't really need to test the drywall on floor 50.
This moves us into a phase where the auditor steps away from the spreadsheet and, physically observes the process. We're talking about the walkthrough, which our sources confirm has been elevated in importance by major regulatory bodies.
The walkthrough procedure is absolutely critical. And while AICPA literature has always supported their use, it was the PCAOB, the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board.
They're the ones who oversee the audits of public companies.
Right. And they significantly elevated the importance of walkthroughs after SOX.
Our source material mentions that. Why did the PCAOB feel the need to step in and add that emphasis?
Because they were finding that auditors were often relying on stale narratives or, just accepting management's description of the control design without physically confirming it.
So they weren't kicking the tires.
Not at all. The core function of the walkthrough is to confirm the design or the physical presence and functioning of the controls. It serves as crucial evidence to support relying on those controls, especially when the audit strategy is to reduce other testing.
It confirms the control isn't just theoretical.
It confirms it's actually being performed as intended in the real world. You do that by tracing one or two transactions from the very beginning all the way to their inclusion in the financial statements. And they're highly appropriate for those detailed transaction-level controls under Principle 12.
I can imagine there's a constant battle for scope here.
Yeah.
How do professionals avoid just wasting documentation effort?
There is a constant need for balance, and it's often difficult to get right. If every single little control has a separate walkthrough, you waste vast amounts of staff time, and you generate a mountain of unnecessary documentation.
But on the other hand,
if a single walkthrough covers too many controls and accounts, it becomes this unwieldy task that is just begging for mistakes and oversights.
and the risk isn't just efficiency. It's the staff getting, as our source material put it, tangled in process descriptions.
That is the most common trap. Staff gets intensely focused on mapping the business process flow, who clicks what button when the email is sent, rather than assessing the controls that are embedded within that process.
And identifying gaps.
Identifying gaps based on the financial statement assertions. The flow charts and narratives, they should be background documents. The walkthrough itself has to maintain this sharp, almost aggressive focus on whether the controls are addressing the relevant risks.
So how does the documentation tool, the walkthrough form from Appendix 13C, how does that help maintain that essential focus for the junior staffer?
The form is designed as a guardrail. It forces the staffer to be risk-aware throughout the entire physical process. It includes specific fields to document the inherent or fraud risks that are relevant to the area being examined, even if those risks were already documented somewhere else. This ensures the staffer is alert to potential issues they should be looking for.
Okay, and what else?
It also prompts for employee feedback on the software or spreadsheets they use, which can either confirm or sometimes refute other evidence about how effective those tools are. It provides a crucial check and balance.
This attention to detail brings us to that shocking true story you mentioned earlier, the one that demonstrates what happens when that focus is lost or when the checklist is just too simple.
This is a powerful illustration. It's about the cost of inadequate documentation and a lack of critical thinking during the walkthrough. In the case, it ultimately led to a fraud and a resulting bankruptcy.
So set the high-risk environment for us. What kind of company was this?
The company was a commercial subprime lender, so they were dealing in non-standard loans against collateral that was often very difficult to value. It's a high-risk environment, prone to judgment errors and potential management manipulation.
And a junior staffer was assigned to this.
A junior staffer was assigned to perform a single walkthrough of the commercial loan approval process control. The instruction was clear. Confirm that the loan was properly secured.
So what did the staffer do?
They executed their checklist diligently, probably feeling satisfied that they were executing their first major control procedure successfully. They checked off that the final approved loan balance was, in fact, less than the appraised value of the collateral.
Okay.
And they confirmed that a required appraisal was physically present in the loan file. For the staffer, the box was green. The control, as defined by their very simple checklist, appeared to be designed and operating effectively.
So on the face of it, the control looked fine. Appraisal was there. Loan was less than the appraisal. What was the failure?
The failure was catastrophic, and it was twofold. And it demonstrates that the documentation was dangerously insufficient because it failed to capture critical management policies.
It was focused on presence, with the paper there.
Instead of policy, did the paper meet the standard?
Exactly. So what were those critical policies that were missed?
First, the loan was made for 90% of the appraised value of the property. The company policy, the very policy used to justify not making a provision for loan losses, mandated that the loan could not be for more than 50% of the appraised collateral value.
Wow.
The staffer only checked less than the appraised value, completely missing that 50% policy threshold.
That is a massive gap. The loan was almost double the maximum limit allowed by their own internal controls.
Exactly. And second, the appraisal itself was a broker appraisal. The company policy explicitly required a company-ordered independent as-is appraisal, meaning it had to reflect the current value, not some valuation based on future development or speculative market increases.
The staffer just checked.
Appraisal and file. They missed the required source and the valuation basis completely.
The implication here is terrifying. The auditor had evidence of deliberate management override in her hands management ordering this specific, non-compliant loan to be made despite clear internal policy, but she was entirely unaware of it.
And she was unaware because the documentation design failed her. This is the crux of the lesson.
So what was management's game here?
Management was specifically ordering these high-risk loans, anticipating that they would default so they could take possession of the collateral, which they internally valued even more highly than the inflated broker appraisal.
Unbelievable.
Because those critical policies, the 50% threshold and the source of the appraisal, were not explicitly integrated into the walkthrough design, the failure went completely undetected. The documentation was merely confirming the existence of a process, not the effectiveness of the control.
And the company went bankrupt.
The company subsequently slid into bankruptcy because they were holding all of these unsaleable properties. It just highlights why the 2013 framework emphasizes moving so far beyond simplistic checklists.
Okay, moving from the human process to the technological foundation, let's revisit the critical importance of IT general controls, or ITGCs. You mentioned their pervasive effect.
Right, and that pervasive effect forces separate, detailed documentation, and it often involves bringing in IT specialists.
Why is that?
Because ITGCs are so foundational. If they are effective, there's a significant payoff. A lot of automated or computer controls can often be confirmed and tested with just one or two transactions. The walkthrough then just serves as a confirmation of the design.
But for complex companies, you need separate evaluations.
You do. For complex, diversely located entities, separate evaluations of ITGCs are usually necessary.
Why the need for separate evaluations across different locations? Shouldn't IT be centralized?
You'd think so, but the reality is that different regions or countries or even product lines might operate with completely independent IT environments, different software versions, different support functions.
So even if the policies are similar.
Even if the policies are similar, the fact that these environments operate independently makes it really difficult to extrapolate the effectiveness you find in one location to all the others. The risk isn't that the policy is different, but that management's execution of it can't be assumed to be the same everywhere.
Let's look at the ITGC assessment form then, Appendix 13D, which guides this analysis. Our sources break this down into 4 critical areas. What's the first one?
The first is the IT control environment. This assesses the high-level governance and structure.
What does that include?
Things like, is the organizational structure appropriate? Is there proper access to senior management and governance? Are duties segregated? Does the staff have adequate knowledge? And crucially, are the IT strategic plans actually aligned with the general business objectives?
If that governance fails, the whole IT function is at risk.
The entire function is susceptible to error and fraud because of a lack of oversight.
Okay, Part 2 focuses on access and security. This seems like the most immediate line of defense.
It is, and it's very detailed. This covers physical safeguards, protection against fire, flood, power loss, as well as intrusion protection from the outside, like firewalls, VPNs, intrusion detection.
And what are the key elements you document here?
Policies for wireless network use, ensuring access to accounting functions is properly segregated and assigned only as needed, and critically, making sure programmers are restricted from accessing live production systems.
If that access control fails, say a programmer can get into the live system, what's the implication?
The integrity of the data is destroyed. If a programmer who writes the code that executes transactions can access the live financial system, they can manipulate the data or introduce unauthorized, untested code.
And this section also requires documenting penetration test results.
It does, and the resolution status of any issues that were identified.
Moving to Part 3. Change controls and new systems development. This is all about managing modification risk.
Right. System modification is a major risk area. So this section covers controls over the development or modification process. Things like approvals for emergency changes, documenting system changes, and crucial pre- and post-implementation testing.
It even calls out backup plans.
It specifically prompts for evidence of backup plans, what happens if the change fails. And it confirms segregation of duties, like keeping programmers separate from the people doing the testing. If these controls fail, unauthorized changes could introduce errors that corrupt data or lead to a material misstatement.
And finally, Part 4. Operations and maintenance.
This covers all the routine activities that are essential for system reliability and business continuity. It assesses backup and restore procedures, including periodic testing of those recovery plans.
Okay.
It requires documentation of user competency and training, the status of disaster recovery plans, and whether the systems are effectively maintained with periodic updates and recommended program patches. If this fails, the system could crash, and management might lose its ability to accurately complete the period-end closing process.
Now, one of the major modern updates in COSO 2013 was recognizing the reality of outsourcing and cloud computing. How are those handled in the documentation process?
The framework fully integrates these business trends now. Entities have to get and read Service Organization Control 1 SOC 1 and SOC 2 reports for all their outsourced functions.
And what do they do with those reports?
Any exceptions noted in those reports have to be assessed for their impact on the entity's own internal control over financial reporting. And since the report date is often before year-end, management has to formally inquire about the controls operating in that gap period between the report date and the financial year-end.
Closing that gap risk.
Exactly. It ensures continuous compliance documentation.
Separately from the high-level ITGCs, the documentation framework also requires an inventory and assessment of all specific software and spreadsheets used in financial reporting. That's Appendix 13E. Why the separation here?
This inventory focuses on specific application risk, which can exist even if the general controls are strong. The form tracks key details about every single financial application or spreadsheet. Is it commercial or entity developed? And crucially, if a risk is identified, for instance, if a legacy system can't be updated because the right personnel or skills aren't available, That risk has to be explicitly recognized in the risk assessment component.
So it forces you to formally factor in the risk of, say, personnel turnover or outdated tech.
It does. It ensures that risk is factored into the overall assessment of control reliability.
And it even drills down to the level of tracking individual spreadsheets, like those used for prepaid insurance allocations.
Yes. Spreadsheets are often the weakest link in the chain. So the form tracks who is responsible if it was modified in the current period, if those modifications were tested, and whether proper controls, security, testing modifications are maintained over that specific spreadsheet itself. It makes sure those manual or semi-automated processes are also covered.
We've documented the controls, walked through the process, assessed the tech. Now we get to the final critical steps, testing those controls through sampling and then summarizing all of the findings. Let's look at documenting sampling first from Appendix 13F.
Sampling documentation is crucial, and it's become much more scrutinized over time. The AICCA, through what's called SAS number 107.
Statement on Auditing Standards in number 107.
Right. It requires that even non-statistical sample sizes have to be comparable to one from a well-designed statistical sample.
Why did that exist? Was it to force non-statistical sampling to be defensible and logical, preventing auditors from just pulling arbitrary numbers?
That's exactly it. You have to justify your sample size choice, so the form documents that entire thought process.
What does it capture?
It captures the control description you're sampling, like dual signature authorization on all checks issued over $5,000. It captures the primary assertion being tested and the crucial definition of an exception.
It also requires the desired reliance level.
Yes, the reliance or assurance level, like high 90% confidence. The tolerable deviation rate, which is the maximum number of failures you'd find acceptable. And the source you use to determine the sample size, maybe citing a table from the 2014 AICPA Audit Sampling Guide.
So the need for this full documentation is clearly driven by external pressure, by challenges from inspectors over poorly documented sample sizes.
It's the defense. This form ensures the logic is defensible and traceable. And furthermore, if the assessment involves placing reliance on the work of others, that factor also has to be considered when you're setting the desired assurance and confidence levels for your own sample.
Finally, after all that work, everything rolls up into the deficiency summary. That's Appendices 13G and H. This is where the team makes the ultimate judgment.
This is the conclusion phase. The assessment team is expected to consider all the deficiencies, not just alone, but also in combination with other deficiencies when they're concluding whether they constitute a significant deficiency or, even worse, a material weakness.
And thus, whether the overall ICFRs are effective.
Right.
Given the need to sort and analyze all this, does the matrix format make a comeback here?
No. While the COSO guidance historically illustrated a matrix summary, a columnar format like a robust Excel spreadsheet is just far more practical for sorting efficiency.
Why is that?
The data needs to be easily sorted by deficiency characteristic, by component, by principal, by assertion, or even by financial statement account or location. A columnar structure just facilitates that much better than a sprawling matrix.
What are the required fields for each deficiency in that summary?
The form captures a deficiency ID, the component and principal affected, a clear description, the severity assessment deficiency, significant deficiency, or material weakness.
It also captures compensating controls and the remediation plan.
Yes, and crucially, the related principles that are affected. This systematic classification is essential for that required multidimensional assessment process. For example, a failure to attract competent people, which is Principle 4, might affect the entity's ability to monitor controls, which is Principle 16.
It must get overwhelming when an entity has hundreds of these issues.
You know, research suggests that the typical number of deficiencies identified, even for larger entities, often falls in a pretty manageable range, maybe 25 to 50 or less.
But what if the number is huge, like 200?
When it's very large, it becomes necessary to perform a stepwise roll-up. You aggregate from the transaction level to the principal level, then up to the component level, and then finally to the overall assessment. This structured process ensures mistakes aren't made during that final aggregate evaluation.
So during that final evaluation of a component, like the control environment, all the deficiencies from its 5 principles are brought together to conclude if that component is effective overall.
Exactly.
We've certainly covered a tremendous amount of ground here, from historical checklists to integrated database management.
The 2013 COSO revision, it truly represents a level of maturity in internal controls guidance. It fully integrates modern issues like outsourcing and the pervasive risk of IT right into its structure.
And what have the results been?
Well, while public companies always have concerns about the cost benefit of this whole extensive exercise, the data does indicate positive results. Since the implementation of the framework, we've seen a measurable decline in the median level of loss from financial reporting frauds in public companies.
And what about restatements?
The number of restatements of prior period financial statements has leveled off. The self-assessment and management certifications that came in after SOX, they do appear to be adding quality to financial reporting.
So what does this all mean? It sounds like this documentation framework, while it's complex, is working and it's built for the long haul.
The hope is that the 2013 framework provides a long period of effectiveness because it has successfully adapted to the business trends of the time, like cloud computing. But auditors and management, they have to continuously adapt their oversight to the approach management is taking.
That brings us to our final provocative thought. The integration of the framework into current business trends. The cloud, outsourcing, that seems largely complete.
Yeah.
But we have to look ahead.
We do.
What new systems or technologies beyond the cloud will challenge the fundamental process of defining effective control over the next decade? And how quickly will the standards need to adapt again?
Consider the rapid, ongoing rise of artificial intelligence adoption. AI is automating decision-making that used to rely on established manual or traditional automated controls. How do we assess controls over systems that are constantly learning and adapting?
Right.
The speed and, the opacity of AI adoption pose a formidable future challenge to the very definition of a predictable, effective internal control that can be easily documented and audited. That is certainly something for you, the learner, to mull over as you see these technologies implemented in the financial sector.